Hey friends, tonight we're stepping away from blood-soaked battlefields and loudmouth heroes for something a little quieter, something colder, something oddly dignified. It's not a war, not a seduction, and not even a punishment though. The gods were always suspiciously good at making dinner feel like all three. This one's about Athena, the goddess of wisdom, war, and oddly enough avoiding dinner parties. Now, before we begin, dim your lights, pull your blanket up, and if you enjoy falling asleep to peculiar corners of ancient history, consider subscribing or just leave a comment letting me know where in the world you're drifting off from tonight. It's always nice to know who else is joining us on these sleepy little detours through time. Okay, so, why did the most brilliant goddess on Mount Olympus often decline to dine with the other gods? Why did she avoid ambrosia feasts, wine gatherings, and those long, echoing halls filled with laughter and divine bickering? The answer, like most things in mythology, is deeply symbolic, and maybe just a little petty. Tonight we won't be chasing monsters. We'll be listening to footsteps down marble halls, watching oil lamps flicker beside empty seats, and hearing the silence of a goddess who, despite all her power, chose solitude over celebration. This is not a story of violence or vengeance. It's a story of distance, of boundaries, and of how, even in myth, some dinners are just too awkward to attend. The silent chair, what the myths whisper about divine distance. It begins with a dinner table, a long one. Polished olive wood, carved with swirls and suns. Oil lamps burn quietly along its length, their flames steady and golden. Amphorae of sweet wine, platters of honeyed figs, roasted boar, steaming gently beneath laurel leaves. The smell is warm and earthy. Oak smoke and fermented sweetness dot at the head of the table. Zeus reclines lazily, beard trimmed, lightning bolt nowhere in sight. Beside him, Hera frowns over her cup. Dionysus laughs too loudly at his own joke, spilling wine onto the hem of Apollo's robe. Aphrodite, radiant, as always, tosses olives into the air and lets them fall into Ares' mouth with flirtatious precision. It's a normal dinner on Olympus, loud, indulgent, beautifully unnecessary, and Athena's chair is emptied again. You single quotes. Do you think the goddess of wisdom would want to sit at the head of conversation, or at least debate Apollo over poetry? But night after night, feast after feast, she stays away, not absent of her absent but apart. Her temple glows on the edge of the mountain. Her shield leans against her wall. Her spear rests beside a quiet brazier. She's home, but she does not eat with them. Not often. Not ever, really. And that absence, polite, composed consistency is the start of something larger, something worth listening to in the quiet of your own room, long after midnight, because sometimes what isn't said at a table tells you more than any toast ever could. What we know and what we don't, unlike the louder gods, Ares with his wars, Aphrodite with her scandals, or Dionysus with his everything. Athena is relatively restrained. There are few myths of her throwing tantrums, storming off, or demanding tribute. She emerges fully formed from Zeus's skull, literally, and from that moment onward she is composed. That's the core of her mythology. Wisdom, restraint, control. She is the goddess of strategy, not chaos. She oversees the planning of battles, not their brutality. She favors cleverness, not seduction. And interestingly, she never marries, she never falls in love, never even flirts. The Greeks referred to her reverently as Parthenosta, virgin goddess, not just in body but in spirit, unattached, unentangled. This status set her apart, even from other goddesses. Hera married Demeter, a mother. Aphrodite, inescapably romantic. Artemis, like Athena, remained chaste but did so with the wildness of a huntress. She fled men. Athena simply did not look up from her scrolls, so when it came to gatherings, especially those thick with gossip, rivalry, and indulgence, it made a certain kind of sense that she stayed away. But it wasn't just about sex, or silence, or even superiority. Athena's refusal to eat at the table reflected her position in the divine order, close to power, but never corrupted by it. Loyal to her father Zeus, but unwilling to play the games that other gods delighted in. Her wisdom kept her apart, and that distance was both a strength and a burden. The feasts of Olympus, not just food. Greek gods did not eat because they were hungry. They consumed ambrosia and drank nectar, substances that did not nourish, but affirmed their divinity. To feast together was to say, we are gods, and we enjoy being gods. It was less dinner, more ritual, a performance of power. To sit at the table was to accept the rules of the table. Alliances, arguments, flirtations, betrayals, oaths, and laughter. Every gesture mattered. Every toast had politics in its flavor. Athena didn't care for such games, and so she distanced herself, not in rebellion, not out of judgment, but perhaps because she saw what those games cost. Look at what happened when others did attend. Dionysus lost his mind more than once. Hera started wars over dinner arguments. Eris, goddess of strife, once threw a golden apple onto the table, engraved with "to the fairest." That single gesture led, indirectly, to the Trojan War. Imagine watching that play out, time and again, and choosing quietly not to participate. That's the kind of wisdom Athena embodied, but it's also the kind that can leave you very alone. A different kind of divinity. Athena's role among the gods was strange from the start. She wasn't born in the usual way, no mother bore her. Zeus swallowed Metis, her pregnant mother, in a panic that she'd give birth to a child more powerful than him. Then one day, he got a headache so immense he begged Hephaestus to split open his skull with an axe. Out sprang Athena, fully grown, fully armored, and utterly calm. Her first breath was in battle gear. Her first step was away from maternal touch. Unlike the other gods, Athena had no peer. She belonged to no domain but her own. No lovers, no tantrums, no compromises. So when the gods lounged and flirted and drank too deeply, perhaps it felt strange to her, unfamiliar, unnecessary. Or perhaps he simply had work to do. Work over wine. There are more images of Athena teaching, planning, and inventing than there are of her reclining. She gave humanity the olive tree, the loom, the plow. She taught mortals to build ships and cities. Her temples were places of law, not debauchery. To the Athenians, she represented idealized reason, the kind that didn't waste time, and so she withdrew from divine parties, not out of shyness, not out of coldness, but because she saw better uses for her time. When others poured wine, she carved strategies. When gods exchanged jests, she sketched architecture. When Olympus echoed with song, she sharpened thought. Perhaps she even believed in preserving her dignity to stay above the squabbles that so often ended in thunderbolts and regrets. But how far can dignity take you before it starts to feel like isolation? The lonely wisdom of Athena. Imagine being the only one at the top of a mountain who never laughs at someone else's misstep, the only one who sees the long consequences of every joke, the only one who never drinks too much, never stumbles, never falls. Imagine knowing everything and being asked to smile silently while others gossip about the mortals you're trying to help. That's what Athena carried. Her wisdom made her beloved by mortals. Her justice made her revered. Her control made her divine. But it also made her a little bit distant. And so the dinner table sat without her night after night, a chair empty, a plate untouched, a goddess alone in the library of Olympus, ink on her fingers, scrolls piled like soft clouds. And yet she did appear sometimes. There are rare stories, very rare, where Athena did attend a divine feast. Usually these were ceremonial, strategic, short. Her expressions were measured. She never got drunk, never let her hair down, never lingered. Her presence was a reminder, not a participant. Like the chime of a clock in a silent room. You hear it, you respect it, and then it passes. Athena was the voice of reason in a chorus of chaos. But how did the other gods feel about her distance? Did Dionysus mock it? Did Hera resent it? Did Zeus worry? Or was that silence part of what made her untouchable, even among immortals? So why did Athena refuse to eat with the other gods? Was it pride? Was it discipline? Or was it the cost of seeing too much and choosing not to indulge? When your job is to hold the sky steady, who has time for olives and laughter? But then again, how long can a goddess sit alone before the silence stops sounding wise and starts sounding just a little bit sad? The olive tree and the mirror, what Athena gave mortals, and denied herself. There's a myth less famous, often overlooked. Athena plants an olive tree, not for herself, of course, for the people of a city that hadn't yet chosen her. In fact, the city had no name at all. It was simply a place of potential, perched between the salty sea and the sun-bleached hills. The gods argued, of course, as they always did, over who would claim it. Poseidon struck the ground with his trident and offered a salty spring. Impressive, dramatic, entirely undried, endry.athena.com, and methodical knelt and pressed her fingers into the dry earth. From that spot, an olive tree grew, its bark knotted and ancient-looking even as it sprouted, its leaves silvery green, its fruit modest but nourishing. It would provide wood, oil, food. It would not command awe. It would require care. And the people chose her. That city, as you might already know, became Athens. The olive tree, legend says, still stood on the Acropolis for centuries. But the important part isn't just that Athena won, it's how she won. Not through force, not through spectacle, but through usefulness. This, more than any thunderbolt or seduction or divine feud, tells you something fundamental about Athena. She offered things that lasted: tools, trees, wisdom, but not affection, and not presence. Even as her gift spread across the land, she herself remained somewhat distant, even from those who named their city after her. The goddess who never slept. Greek mythology is full of sleeping gods. Zeus often fell asleep after his passions or proclamations. Hermes slept mid-mission. Even Hera was known to doze off after large feasts. The gods were, in many ways, exaggerated mortals, taller, stronger, immortal, but filled with very human appetites. Athena, however, never seems to sleep. There are no myths of her dreaming, no stories of her lulled into slumber, tricked, relaxed. She is always awake, watching, calculating, sharp. Some say this was a metaphor for perpetual awareness. Others see it as a kind of curse, never to rest, never to release control. Imagine being so wise, so constantly alert, that sleep becomes foreign to you. Even in temples built to her, statues show her standing, never reclining, never at ease. spear in hand, eyes wide, feet planted. Mortals prayed to her before battle, before crafting a ship, before passing judgment, but they never asked her for comfort. That wasn't her domain. Reflections in still watering, another lesser-known story. Athena invents the flute. She picks up a deer bone and crafts it into a wind instrument, delighted by the sound it makes. But as she plays, the other gods laugh not at the music, but at her cheeks puffing up her face. Contorting. Athena, rarely vain, becomes curious. She walks to a still pool of water and looks at herself. She sees the distortion the flute makes, the loss of control, the way it undoes her usual composed image, and so she throws the flute away. Forever, the symbolism here is quiet but sharp. She created something beautiful, but because it compromised her image, she cast it aside. This is a goddess who won't even allow her face to wrinkle in joy. It's a heartbreaking kind of dignity, one that comes at the cost of self-expression. Imagine choosing to forego a gift you invented because it made you look too human. It's the kind of choice that slowly builds a wall, soundproof, golden, between you and the rest of the table. Boundaries among immortals. There are many ways to define divinity. In some traditions, gods are vast and distant, unknowable, unchanging. In others, they are deeply personal, flawed, emotional. Greek gods were unique because they combined both. They could be both ridiculous and reverent, petty and powerful. But Athena, she leaned more toward the distant type. While Ares rushed into battle and Apollo strummed his lyre, Athena always calculated. Her presence in myth is often accompanied by structure, city's law, logic. And structure requires boundaries. She refused advances. She avoided indulgences. She did not sit at chaotic tables because she understood the cost of disorder. She saw what happened when gods meddled too deeply. Think of her half-brother Ares, constantly wounded, humiliated, his reputation stained by rashness. Or Dionysus, consumed by ecstasy, he lost the ability to function in the mortal world. Even Aphrodite, for all her allure, suffered heartbreak after heartbreak. Athena observed and chose restraint. But how much restraint is too much? At what point does wisdom harden into detachment? The mortal women who tried to get close. Perhaps the most telling stories about Athena's solitude are not about her but about the women who tried to know her. Take Arachne, the talented mortal weaver. She was so skilled that she claimed to be better than the gods. Athena, curious or insulted, disguised herself and visited Arachne's home. There she saw the weaving for herself, elegant, detailed, extraordinary. In response, Athena challenged her to a weaving contest. Arachne accepted. They wove side by side. Athena's tapestry was flawless, depicting the power and majesty of the gods, but Arachne's was perhaps more impressive, depicting the gods' cruelties and scandals. Athena, unable to fault the skill, punished the content. She destroyed Arachne's work and transformed her into a spider. What do we make of this? That even when someone matched her intellect, Athena could not tolerate being emotionally seen. Her myths could be interpreted but not critiqued. Even praise had to come within boundaries. It was not anger that drove her punishment. It was discomfort, vulnerability, the fear of being too near. A temple with no feast in Athens, her greatest temple, was the Parthenon, literally, the maiden's place. It held her towering statue, gold and ivory, a spear in one hand, Nike victory in the other. Her face was serene, her eyes unblinking, but there was no banquet hall inside. Number fire pit, no lounge. Unlike other temples, where feasting and festival went hand in hand with prayer, the Parthenon was about order, procession, offerings, yes, but from a distance. Even in the city named for her, Athena kept her distance. She ruled not with affection, but with architecture. She was revered, but not beloved in the way Dionysus was. Feared, but not loathed like Ares. Admired, but not toasted like Hermes. Her followers whispered in libraries, not shouted in stadiums. They debated laws in her name, not drank wine. It was a temple built for thinking, not feeling. So why did she give so much, yet take so little? Athena gave mortals the olive tree, the loom, shipbuilding, mathematics, rhetorical statistics, the idea of law itself, and in return, she asked for little. No great romances, no wild festivals, no mortal lovers. Even her most famous child, Erichthonius, was born not through her body, but from an awkward myth involving Hephaestus and a cloth. We'll spare the details here, though they are, let's just say, Greek. She remained untouched, and in doing so, perhaps unknowable. So again, why did Athena refuse to eat with the other gods? Maybe it's not that she refused, but that she saw no need. In a world where every toast could start a war, where every compliment masked a rivalry, where every feast ended in drama, perhaps the only wise choice was silence. But here's the question. Was that wisdom or fear? Was her distant strength or an armor she could never take off? And if you give everything knowledge, tools, peace, but hold back your presence, have you truly joined the world you shaped? So the table sits again, long and golden in the candlelight. The wine flows, the laughter rises, and gods jostle each other for stories, affection, and attention. Somewhere between Apollo's lyre and Dionysus's slurred jokes, you might glance over at that one quiet chair. It's still empty. Not because Athena wasn't invited, not because she was forgotten, but because, in a world of divine noise, she chose not to participate. This is the final piece of her myth, less dramatic than a battle, quieter than a transformation, and yet more enduring than any love affair. On Mount Olympus, not because while the other gods are remembered for chaos, Athena is remembered for structure. Where Zeus thundered, she legislated. Where Aphrodite seduced, she invented. Where Ares fell in battle, she strategized behind the lines. And long after the feasts faded into myth, her gifts remained in the hands of mortals. Athens, after Athena, the city that bore her name, didn't just build her temples. It built its identity around her. She became the symbol of civic order, of logical debate, of disciplined art and war. The owl, her companion, was stamped onto coins. Her statue watched over the courts. Her name was invoked not during prayers for fertility or rain or luck, but when mortals debated ethics, designed new legal systems, or laid out plans for aqueducts. Athena was not a goddess you begged. She was a goddess you emulated. Her absence from Olympus's feasts was mirrored by her presence in classrooms and senate halls, or silence at the table, made space for reason to echo elsewhere. And while the other gods faded into the background of stories, Athena remained relevant wherever thinking still mattered. The final myths, Athena in decline. By the time the Romans absorbed the Greek pantheon, Athena became an urba quieter still, even more reserved. The Romans saw her as the goddess of wisdom and war, yes, but also of technical skill. She was revered by artisans, engineers, scribes. Fewer stories were told of her in this era, fewer scandals. She simply remained like a library that no one visits anymore but refuses to fall into dust in time. Other gods were worshipped. New religions arrived. Temples crumbled, but Athena didn't disappear. She became a statue in the background of museums, a symbol on university seals, an allegorical figure in Renaissance paintings. She entered the minds of Enlightenment philosophers, who admired her lack of indulgence. She wasn't forgotten, just quietly respected. Even now, in a world of noise, Athena's image remains associated with logic, reason, calm. A strange legacy for a goddess who never joined the party. What did the other gods think? It's worth wondering, what did the others feel, seeing that empty seat? Did Hera roll her eyes and assume superiority? Did Apollo secretly miss her challenge to his poetry? Did Dionysus leave a cup untouched in her honor? We'll never know, but we do know this. When the myths were written down, retold, copied onto parchment and whispered into classrooms, Athena's silence spoke louder than their revelry. While others fought and feasted, she built, and while the others celebrated, she worked. The feasts are gone, the work remains. The loneliness of the wise. There's a truth here, one that echoes beyond mythology. The wisest people in the room are often the quietest. The most focused minds often walk alone. The strongest wills often carry invisible burdens. Athena's refusal to dine wasn't a gesture of superiority. It was perhaps a gesture of clarity. In a world where gods could be petty and mortal lives could be crushed by divine whims, she offered a different model: restraint, order, perspective. But it's a lonely model. One that required stepping away from pleasure to preserve meaning. One that demanded she guard her image at the cost of intimacy. One that made her immortal, but also untouchable. So maybe the empty chair at the feast isn't just about dinner. Maybe it's about the cost of being the one who always sees too far ahead. Athena's lesson to the sleepy listener, you, listening now tucked in, letting your mind soften into quiet, might wonder what any of this has to do with you. After all, you're not a god. You're not at a feast on Olympus. You probably don't own a spear or an owl, but maybe, in your own life, you've chosen reason over popularity. Maybe you've stepped back when others rushed forward. Maybe you've been the calm voice in the loud room, the steady presence in a swirl of chaos. Maybe you've had your own empty chair moments where you could have joined, but didn't, where you felt the weight of wisdom and the hush that follows. Athena reminds us that distance isn't always rejection. Sometimes it's preservation, sometimes it's purpose, and sometimes it's just the result of carrying something larger than yourself, like strategy, like cities, like peace. So the next time you feel out of place in a noisy world, remember, even the gods sometimes chose the silence, and that silence built civilizations. Boring history for sleep. How ancient Roman firefighters fought with buckets and politics, buckets, ladders, and bribes. The daily fire duty of ancient Rome. Hey friends, before we drift too far into the embers of the past tonight, take a breath, dim the lights, let the room go soft, maybe pour some water or two lukewarm. Of course, just like the bathhouses we'll talk about soon. And if you haven't already, subscribe for more quietly riveting stories of old jobs, old lives, and the small dusty details that once kept empires standing. Now tonight's story isn't about emperors or legions. It's about buckets and charred wood and a profession that stank of smoke, sweat, and politics. Let's talk about Roman firefighters. Yes, Rome had them. And no, they weren't heroic. Men with shiny helmets and water hoses. They were slaves, or volunteers, or bribed bureaucrats. They used wooden buckets, wet blankets, hooks, and their main strategy, when faced with a burning building, tear down the one next to it. Fire was not a surprise in ancient Rome. If you've ever tried lighting a candle in a stone apartment, you'll know how slowly fire catches on modern materials. But ancient Rome was built of wood, dry wood, tarred wood, roofs of straw, shutters of pine, and everything from bathhouses to butcher stalls used open flame, oil lamps, charcoal braziers, cooking pits, forge fires. There were no fire codes, no alarms, no citywide hydrants. The most flammable capital in the Mediterranean relied mostly on luck and late-night yelling to prevent catastrophe. In fact, one Roman proverb advised, if your neighbor's house is on fire, wet your own roof, not to help them, but to keep it from spreading. Fire was so common that even the urban layout prepared for it. Most multifamily Roman apartment blocks in Salah were stacked tightly, with poor ventilation, crumbling staircases, and a tendency to collapse even before catching fire. Once one of them burned, they all did. Enter the vigils, Rome's smoky night watch in 06 CE. Emperor Augustus, ever the reformer, created the cohorts vigilum, Rome's first formal firefighting corps. It was a professionalized force. Well, semi-professional. These weren't noble soldiers or proud engineers. The vigils were mostly freedmen, former slaves granted their freedom, who now earned small wages patrolling the city at night. They worked in shifts, carried buckets, sounded alarms by banging metal, and used wet blankets to smother flames, or demolition tools to pull buildings down before they spread the fire. The primary tool wasn't water, it was destruction. A two-story bakery on fire. Break into the fishmonger's next door and smash the wall down. It wasn't graceful, it wasn't efficient, but it occasionally worked. They even had water brigades stationed near cisterns, where large jars of water were stored. But getting water from the cistern to a fourth-floor wooden bedroom in the middle of the night, that took more faith and skill. Roman firefighting gear, wet rags and muscle here. What you'd find in a typical vigil's toolkit, a leather bucket, hooks and poles for ripping beams apart. Blankets soaked in vinegar, lardish, and pulled carts with axes and ropes and or ash to smother flame at the source. There was no protective gear, no oxygen tanks, no gloves, just togas, tunics, and maybe a wet head wrap for luck. In many cases, the goal wasn't to put out the fire, but to contain it. If you could knock down enough adjacent supports or smother the core flame, you might save half the street. Otherwise, you prayed the wind shifted. Bribes and burned property. The shadow economy of fire now. Here's where things get even more Roman meaning. Political. There's evidence that firefighting sometimes came with a price. If your shop or bakery caught fire, the vigils might arrive, look at the flames and wait. Why? Because wealthy property owners could be bribed to prioritize certain buildings, or, more cynically, charged to save their property. Worse still, if your competitor's shop went up in flames, there were plenty of reasons not to shout for help. In some cases, suspicious fires conveniently cleared valuable land, especially if developers wanted to erect more profitable buildings. This wasn't standard practice, of course, but Rome was a city where corruption wasn't accidental. It was built into the bricks. Even Emperor Nero, before his infamous fiddling episode, had proposed the idea of wide fire breaks and public emergency access roads, but such reforms were too expensive for landowners and too unpopular among slumlords, and so fires raged, markets smoldered, streets vanished overnight, and the vigils ran in behind with hooks, buckets, and maybe a coin or two in their pocket. Sleep with one eye open if you lived in a Roman insula. Fire was a nightly fear. Many tenants, especially those on upper floors, slept in their clothes. Families placed sandals beside doorways and buckets near windows. Children were taught escape routes, involving climbing down beams or out across shared ledges. There were no fire escapes, no drills, no insurance. You simply listened for the banging of copper pots or the shouts of IGNIS, Latin for fire. Once a fire started, time was everything. The building wouldn't wait for you to grab valuables. The staircases, often made of dry timber, collapsed within minutes. Some records suggest that whole neighborhoods were reduced to ash in hours, then so people slept lightly, or didn't sleep at all. The fire that changed everything in 64 CE. Rome suffered one of the most infamous urban disasters in ancient history, the Great Fire of Rome. It began perhaps in a merchant store near the Circus Maximus. By the time it was over, 10 of the city's 14 districts had burned. Entire hills glowed with embers. The vigils were overwhelmed. Even elite citizens and household slaves were recruited into fire lines, but it was too late. The wind changed direction several times. Fire leaped from tiled roofs to wooden ones. Warehouses, temples, insula gone. And what did Emperor Nero do? Well, here's where history gets murky. Some sources claim he wasn't in the city at all. Others claim he played a lyre and sang of Troy while watching the fire spread. Others still claim he opened his palaces to refugees. But one thing is clear. He blamed the Christians, and in doing so, he turned public anger away from the empire's mismanagement and onto a scapegoat. That fire led to the first major persecution, of Christians. It also resulted in new city regulations, more stone, less wood, better spacing between buildings. But none of those regulations would have mattered without the people still willing to carry buckets into flame, even if they were underpaid, even if they arrived too late. Asterisk the quiet after the flame. When a Roman fire died down, it left more than smoke. It left emptiness, quiet, the hollow sound of a city waking up to blackened beams and ash where the bakery used to be. For the vigils, there was no parade, no medals, just sore hands, splinters, and the knowledge that next week it would happen. Again. Rome never truly beat fire. It just survived it again and again thanks to slaves, freedmen, and the sound of wet blankets hitting burning walls. So the next time you think of ancient Rome, don't imagine just emperors in marble or chariots in the forum. Imagine a man standing on a rickety ladder, throwing vinegar-soaked rags through a burning window, wondering if the flames would turn back toward him. He wasn't a hero, he wasn't remembered. But for 1 hour, in the middle of the night, he kept a block from turning to ash. If you've ever tried to sleep in a city built almost entirely out of wood, you might understand what it was like for a Roman insular tenant. In the 1st century, the walls creaked in the wind. The smell of smoke was always faintly there, like an old scar. Rats scratched between beams, and somewhere down the alley, a brazier was left burning again. But you couldn't do anything about it. Not really. So you closed your eyes and hoped that, tonight, the vigils were awake. They were Rome's only real fire protection. And they weren't elite guards or trained engineers. Just working men with soft sandals, tired eyes, and leather buckets swinging from their arms. Shifts in the smoke. The vigils worked in 7 cohorts, each assigned to 2 of the city's 14 districts. Each cohort had about 1,000 men. Some sources say more, some less. They were divided into centuries, overseen by a centurion, much like the military, but their job was less about war and more about watching. They patrolled mostly at night. The evening shift walked streets with torches, checked alleyways, sniffed for smoke, and kept an ear out for shouting, which was Rome's main early warning system. They weren't alone, either. Each cohort had a quarrymen assigned to water supply duty, siphonary, men trained to operate the siphonary, a sort of rudimentary water pump. Speculators, lookouts who watched from rooftops or towers. They weren't well paid. They weren't celebrated, but they had beds in their station houses, called stations, scattered throughout the city, usually built near aqueduct outlets for easy water access. The typical shift began at sunset and ended after sunrise, just as the street vendors started setting up. And while much of the job was walking, looking, and hauling buckets, they also performed what we might now call public safety, clearing alleys, removing fire hazards, even breaking up nighttime brawls. Station houses where the vigils slept. Each stasio served as a base of operations, often a small barrack-like structure with a courtyard, a water tank, hooks for tools, and sleeping quarters for the men off duty. The beds were simple raised wood, straw mats, maybe a blanket if you were lucky, in between fire calls. The men would mend tools, train with ropes and ladders, or just sit quietly sharpening axes. There were no radios, no alarms, just men listening to the wind, hoping their district would stay quiet until dawn. Sometimes a runner from another cohort would appear breathless in the dark. Fire Subura district, and then everything moved quickly. Wet cloaks were thrown on, hooks were grabbed, carts were pushed out onto cobbled streets, and another night was swallowed by smoke, fires, and forums when the rich got involved. Now, firefighting wasn't just a poor man's business in Rome. Even the rich had a role to play. Many elite families owned entire insulae as rental properties, meaning a fire could wipe out a year's income in minutes. So they had private slaves trained to assist the vigils. Some even paid for local cisterns or built extra staircases in their properties, though this was rare and mostly symbolic. The more responsible ones would leave detailed fire instructions with their tenants: where to find the sandbin, how to soak woolen cloth, which rooftop provided the best escape. But more often, the elite lived far from the danger. They watched their buildings burn from their villas on the Palatine Hill, and when insurance, which didn't exist, couldn't help, they appealed to patronage. 2 favors, 2 rebuilding loans. To the emperor, after the Great Fire of 64 CE, Nero seized large tracts of burned-out property and built his massive golden house, the Domus Array, on top of them. This didn't sit well with the public, and rumors, the spread that Nero had sung during the blaze, that his men delayed the vigils, that fires meant power if you knew how to rebuild. And so, fire became political. Not just destruction, but a means of redirection, rewards for smoke and silence despite the danger. Many vigils served voluntarily, though not out of civic duty. Alone. Being a vigil, while physically exhausting, came with social perks. Freedmen could serve and earn public recognition. Some gained favor with the wealthy through well-timed rescues. Others used the position to gain citizenship benefits, or if lucky, a recommendation from a local patronus for a better role. The system wasn't glamorous, but it worked. Enough there are tombstones still etched with quiet pride. Here lies Publius Annuus, a vigil, brave in the flames, watchful at the gates. No statues were built for them, but the streets they saved brick by hard-won brick remained. A fire that wasn't told, peculiar story, rarely told as of a fire that never happened. A bakery in the eventing district had left its oven glowing too. Long smoke rose, neighbors panicked. A slave ran to the nearest station, breathless. But when the vigils arrived, the fire had gone out, just soot and frightened eyes. Still, the protocol had to be followed. A report was made. The baker found the oven dismantled. It may sound harsh, but that overreaction likely saved the district the following winter, when another shop owner remembered the punishment and kept a better watch. In Rome, sometimes the fire you prevent is the most heroic fire. Drills, not quite. Did the Romans have fire drills? Not in the modern sense, but the vigils conducted regular training exercises. They practiced using their primitive ciphers, manual pumps mounted on carts, operated by turning large cranks. They rehearsed climbing walls with ladders, and they ran tests on rooftop travel, learning how to cross beams and tiles to reach upper floors. Record suggests that Emperor Domitian even mandated quarterly inspection rounds, where officers assessed building flammability. Were these rules always followed? Of course not, but the intent was there, and over time, even as the empire expanded, the vigils models spread to other Roman cities: Alexandria, Carthage, Antioch. Firefighting became part of the imperial identity. Rome had many enemies, but fire was its oldest. When the fires died down, dawn was when fires gave up, not because the flames respected daylight, but because the world around them woke up. Vendors returned, tenants swept ashes, neighbors inspected beams and replaced linens. The vigils dragged their carts back to the station. They'd rinse soot from their hands, eat bread and olives, maybe sleep, maybe just sit quietly. They weren't saints, they weren't flawless, but they were present. And in a city that too often valued spectacle over substance, their presence, wet, smoky, tired, was enough. So tonight, as you drift into your own sleep, remember the men who tried to stay awake, who walked alleyways in silence, who listened for the whisper of fire in the distance, and ask yourself, would you have heard it? Would you have run? Would you have carried the bucket? Or would you have been one of the few who knew the signs and doused the spark before it ever caught? By now, you've walked those smoky alleys. You've seen the vigils at work, climbing creaking ladders in the dark, soaking cloaks in vinegar, swinging their hooked poles against crumbling beams. And as you drift further into this quiet corner of Roman life, you begin to sense something else. That fighting fire in ancient Rome wasn't just about stopping flames, it was about holding together a city that constantly tried to fall apart. Rome, after all, was a city at odds with itself, beautiful but fragile, grand but perpetually smoldering. In the vigils, these underpaid, underappreciated freedmen were the only ones standing between civilization and collapse. Let's linger there a moment longer. Rome, city of wood and wonder for all its marble monuments and imperial arches. Rome was fundamentally a wooden city. The famous structures, the Colosseum, the aqueducts, the palaces. Sure, there were stone, but 90% of the city lived in insulia, those multi-story timber-framed apartment blocks packed tight along winding narrow streets. Each building was a hazard. One oil lamp knocked over, one kitchen left unattended, one winter brazier too close to a woven curtain, and the whole block could be gone before morning. Fires in Rome weren't isolated events. They were woven into the city's seasonal rhythm, like market days or festivals. And over time, the Romans became resigned to it. You didn't ask if there would be a fire. You just asked where it would be next. The fire of 191 CE. When the Forum burned, let's take a moment to visit one particular night, the fire of 191 CE, which tore through the very heart of the city. The blaze started near the Via Sacra, the central street of the Roman Forum. Wind carried sparks to the nearby temple of Vesta, one of the city's holiest sites. The Vestal Virgins, Rome's sacred priestesses, were rushed out as flames licked at the ancient roundhouse. Several temples collapsed. The Basilica Julia, a center of public life, crumbled. Even the Arch of Severus, newly constructed, was scorched and blackened. And yet, it was the vigils who arrived first. They didn't save everything they couldn't, but they formed fire. Lines from the Tiber hauled stones from crumbling arches and kept the flames from reaching the Capitoline Hill. Had they failed, Rome's spiritual and political core might have been reduced to rubble. The emperor at the time, Commodus, responded by blaming mismanagement and issuing new firefighting decrees, but he didn't thank the vigils. Few ever did. Their names aren't carved into arches, but the city still stood. When the bucket meant hope, there's something profoundly human about the image of a man with a bucket of water standing in front of a burning building. He knows it's not enough, but he throws it anyway. The vigils embodied that gesture day after day, decade after decade. They knew the system was inadequate, that many fires couldn't be stopped, that bribes, bad architecture, and imperial disinterest often made their work feel hopeless. But they still answered every shout, hauled every wet blanket, patrolled every alley, because sometimes the fire was small enough to stop, and sometimes even one saved building meant 5 families had somewhere to sleep the next night in a city of millions. That counted for something. The long decline. Firefighting after Rome fell. So what happened to firefighting when the Western Roman Empire collapsed? For a while it disappeared as centralized authority crumbled in the 5th century CE. The vigils faded with it. Their stations were abandoned, their tools scattered. Cities turned inward, focused on survival rather than public safety. Fires raged unchecked in the centuries that followed. It would take nearly 1,000 years before organized urban firefighting returned in Europe. In medieval cities like London and Paris, often sparked, no pun intended, by repeated catastrophes. But even then, echoes of the Roman model remained. Bucket brigades, watchmen, night patrols, cistern systems. Rome's smoky legacy endured not in glory, but in practicality. The quiet honor of the unsung. You've likely never heard the name of a Roman vigil. There are no heroic poems about them, no frescoes of daring rescues, no temples built in their memory, but you can find hints. Inscriptions carved on gravestones. He carried the torch but never let it fall. He stood watch as others slept. He fell with the roof beam. Saving three keys were real people. Freedmen, immigrants, laborers. They weren't warriors. They didn't conquer Gaul or win chariot races. They simply kept the city from burning a little longer. And that, perhaps, is the deepest kind of heroism, the kind that leaves no mark, but makes all marks possible. Fire as a metaphor for lean back for a final thought. Imagine the Roman Empire as a city constantly on fire, not literally, but symbolically. Corruption, greed, expansion, rebellion, a different kind of blaze. And all the while, a few individuals run around with buckets. Not enough to stop the flames entirely, but just enough to keep the walls from collapsing. The vigils weren't just firefighters, they were a metaphor. They represent every quiet force that holds civilization together behind the scenes. Janitors, in parlance, code inspectors, overworked nurses, underpaid archivists, the people whose names aren't remembered, but whose absence would be catastrophic. So tonight, as you fall asleep, let the image stay with you. A dark Roman alley, the air thick with smoke, footsteps echoing on damp stone, and a small group of men dragging their cart into a blaze, hoping the wind stays still just a little longer. Not for fame, not for favor, but simply because someone had to. Hey there, sleepy scholars. Before we begin tonight's descent into the underfloor world of Elizabethan England, take a breath, dim the lamps. Make sure your tea's not to hot room temperature is historically accurate, after all, and maybe open a window just enough to hear a breeze. Tonight, we're not following kings or explorers, we're following tales. Long, grimy, twitching tales. This is the story of the Tudor rat, one of history's least respected, yet most successful survivors, and as you'll soon learn, rats in 16th century England didn't just survive, they thrived. They outmaneuvered dogs, they ducked inspectors, they lived in parliament walls and beneath peasant beds, and in many cases, they had more freedom of movement and fewer rules than the humans around them. The Rat's Kingdom, London, 1580. Let's imagine a street in Elizabethan London. The air is thick with the scent of damp wool, horse manure, burnt tallow, and a faint, constant trace of open sewage. It's early evening, and shopkeepers are dousing their lanterns with a hiss. Below street level, beneath wooden boards, between floor joists and food cellars, comes the quiet rustle of movement. That's not the wind, that's a rat, or 5 rats in the Tudor imagination. To understand why rats were both feared and weirdly respected in this era, you have to understand the Elizabethan worldview. People believed deeply in order. Everyone had a place in the so-called great chain of being, from the monarch down to the beetles. Rats, however, defied this order. They belonged to no class. They answered to number lord. They went where they pleased, stole what they liked, and vanished into walls before justice could be served out to the average Londoner. Rats were a sign of decay, yes, but also a dark marvel able to squeeze through keyholes, chew through bone, and avoid even the cleverest traps. Folk beliefs often described rats as devil's spies, messengers of misfortune. Children were warned that rats could whisper secrets to witches, and yet, oddly, few laws protected homes from infestation. If your neighbor's cellar exploded with vermin, well, that was God's will, or maybe your sin. The plague problem, and its overlooked passenger now. We can't talk rats without touching on plague. By the late 1500s, England had survived multiple outbreaks of plague, especially in 1563, when London alone lost over 20,000 people. But here's the detail worth remembering. People blamed the air, not the rat. The dominant theory of disease at the time was miasma, bad smelly air. Doctors wore beaked masks filled with herbs to filter the rot. They burned incense in alleyways. They opened windows and prayed. But the rat, it went unnoticed. Or worse, it was considered a consequence, not a cause, a symptom of moral failure, a punishment for vice. People feared plague as a cloud, not as a bite. Meanwhile, in the rafters and bedstraw, fleas, hitched rides, they preferred rats to humans. But when the rat died quickly and quietly, they moved on to you, rat catchers, the least successful professionals, of course. Some people tried to fight back. The Tudor rat catcher was a known urban figure, usually male, often reeking, dressed in rough wool and sometimes carrying a sack of half-dead weasels or ferrets used to flush out rodents from walls. They worked house by house, cellar by cellar, their tools, a long stick with a pronged end, a pair of leather gloves, a cage of traps baited with stale cheese or pig fat, and often small terrier trained to chase and snap. Rat catchers were paid poorly, sometimes in coin, sometimes in leftover bread. Their work was filthy, and worse, it rarely made much of a dent. Why? Because Tudor London was a perfect rat habitat. Open refuse, piles, broken drainage walls, cellars full of grain, and laws that banned cats from certain areas, especially markets. Due to superstition, so, even as the rat catcher toiled, the rats laughed behind the wall. Rats versus peasants, who really had more rights. Here's the uncomfortable comparison. A rat in 1580 could freely travel from one end of London to the other without paying a toll, answering to a guard or swearing fealty, could hide in a noble's cellar, nest in the linen of a commoner, or even chew its way into court buildings. No one stopped it. A peasant, not so much. Ordinary laborers in Tudor England lived under tight restrictions. Movement between towns required permission papers. Sleeping outdoors was a jailable offense. Gathering wood in the wrong forest could land you in stocks. Even baking bread at home could violate market regulations. So while a rat chewed its way through London's food supply, a poor man could be hanged for stealing a single loaf. Rats didn't pay rent, they didn't tithe, and they never had to kneel to the Queen. That contrast didn't go unnoticed. Some pamphlets and poems from the time mockingly compared corrupt nobles to rats gnawing at the kingdom. Unseen, unstoppable. A rat's eye view of Tudor life. Shrink ourselves for a moment. You are a rat in Tudor London. You enter a bakery through a drain. The floor is dusted in spilled flour. The bread oven radiates warmth. There's a bin of barley too large to guard properly, and the apprentice is asleep. You take what you like later. You travel through a timber beam to a tavern. There's spilled ale, a slice of meat under a bench. The patrons snore in straw beds above, and no one stirs as you pass by dawn. You're in the walls of a merchant's home, listening as he argues over accounts, never knowing you've chewed 3 inches into his grain sacks. You are small, you are fast. You are oddly free. Rat lore and superstition. The Elizabethans were deeply suspicious of rats, even if they couldn't explain them. Some believed rats could predict death, like crows. Others swore rats were spies for witches, or even familiars in disguise. One popular folk remedy involved hanging a dried rat corpse in your chimney to ward off illness. Another involved grinding rat bones into powder and swallowing it to cure fever. These ideas seem absurd now, but they reflect a culture that respected rats as almost magical in their resilience. Even Shakespeare references them. Indirectly in Hamlet, the famous rat behind the arrows is a symbol of lurking corruption. Not just a creature, but a force unseen dangerous. Creeping beneath royal floors, still they thrive despite efforts to catch them, trap them, banish them, burn them, and blame them. Rats persisted. They adapted. Some grew larger, some turned nocturnal, some even learned to avoid baits laced with bitter herbs. And while humans slept, or argued about theology and succession and sin, the rats just kept chewing. So as you close your eyes tonight, maybe imagine that quiet life beneath the Tudor city, a dark tunnel beneath a butcher's stall, a nest of dry rags behind a wine barrel, a world with no laws, no sermons, no guilds or taxes, only the sounds of creaking wood, distant boots, and the heartbeat of a city always one candle away from disaster. The next time you think the modern legal system is strange, consider this. In parts of early modern Europe, including Tudor England, it was not entirely uncommon to try animals in court. Yes, animals, with formal accusations, summoned witnesses, trials before magistrates, and on occasion punishments. And the rat, though small and elusive, was sometimes called to account. Not that the rat ever showed up, of course, but that didn't stop the proceedings tonight. We dive deeper into the peculiar and meticulous mindset that allowed people to write laws about rats, hold ceremonies blaming them for destruction, and yet still failed to keep them out of the flour barrel. When rats were summoned to court, records from across Europe and not just England document curious moments when rats and other animals were legally prosecuted. While these formal animal trials were more common in French-speaking regions, the English, in their way, were no less theatrical. Imagine a town official standing in a market square reading a summons aloud to the rats dwelling in the grain cellars of Southwell Parish. You are hereby commanded to vacate the premises within 7 days, or face the full authority of ecclesiastical judgment. Yes, really, the act of summoning rats, often accompanied by the ringing of a bell or prayers to Saint Gertrude, the unofficial rat repellent of the Middle Ages, was part law, part ritual, part desperate hope. The townspeople didn't expect the rats to obey, but by performing the ritual they reasserted human order in a world constantly chewed apart at the edges. It was less about the rats leaving, and more about proving that someone was still in charge. The rat trial at Autun, its English cousins. The most famous rat trial happened in Autun, France, in 1522. But its absurd logic echoes in Elizabethan England too. In the Autun case, the court accused local rats of destroying barley crops. A lawyer, yes, a real lawyer, was appointed to defend them. He argued, among other things, that the summons had not been properly delivered and that the rats could not safely travel to court due to the presence of cats along the route. While this particular case didn't happen under Elizabeth's reign, it made its way into English pamphlets and sermons. The idea that vermin could be addressed through law, that order could be restored with parchment and wax, resonated in a time when chaos often ruled on in England. Smaller-scale rat condemnations took place at the parish level, often led by clergy. If crops failed or granaries were overrun, public readings from the pulpit would name the rats as thieves in the eyes of God. There are no known cases of a rat being hanged in England, but in Switzerland and Italy, pigs, roosters, and goats were not so lucky. Rats and religious guilt. The Tudor world was drenched in spiritual interpretation. Rats were more than pests. They were divine reminders in Protestant pamphlets. Rats were described as the knot of grace, the teeth of Babylon, foul heralds of the flesh in Catholic circles. They were sometimes seen as manifestations of temptation, especially when they chewed holy books or invaded convent pantries. These acts weren't just inconvenient, they were symbolic. A rat that destroyed bread wasn't just ruining food, it was corrupting the body, the Eucharist, the divine order. And so, their punishment took on ritual forms: burning infested straw with incense, sprinkling holy water into rat holes, and in one noted example, an entire village fasting for a day to drive the vermin out by prayer. None of it worked, but that wasn't the point. The point was trying, doing something, reminding each other that they could respond, even when the walls were moving at night. The rat economy. Now let's shift focus from theology to economics. Rats were not just unwelcome guests, they were financial liabilities. In a city with no health codes and minimal food preservation, one rat could mean the loss of a week's grain, 2 rats a failed pie business, 10 rats a winter without bread. And yet, many business owners couldn't afford to protect their goods. Hiring a rat catcher was expensive. Hiring a boy with a stick was risky. So instead, they adopted strategies like storing flour in barrels sealed with wax, keeping dried mint and tansy leaves around cellars believed to repel rats, building false walls to hide grain stores. None of these were foolproof. And yet again, the rats prospered. In a strange twist, some people benefited from rats. Rat catchers made modest livings. Apothecaries sold rat poison, often arsenic-based, with elaborate instructions. And certain herbalists sold rat repellents that did absolutely nothing but smelled aggressively like vinegar and regret. There were even whispered rumors that some landlords encouraged rats in their tenants' quarters so they could raise rents or demand bribes to take care of the problem. As always, the poor bore the burden. Rats had free rein. Peasants had contracts. Rats in the Shakespearean stage. Let's not forget that Shakespeare was writing during all this. His audiences knew rats well. In The Tempest, Caliban curses Prospero with all the charms of Sycorax: toads, beetles, bats, light on you. In Macbeth, the witches use parts of vermin in their boiling spells. And in Hamlet, the rat behind the arrows is not just a literal intruder, it's a metaphor for corruption, lurking in the walls of power. Rats, in Elizabethan imagination, weren't just animals, they were symbols of decay. They moved in silence, and they knew things. No wonder they terrified people. No wonder they were given legal trials and divine sermons and herbal burnings. No wonder none of it worked. A rat's freedom measured in loopholes. There were no real rat prisons, no rat taxes, no laws requiring rats to register with a guild. And so, in a strange way, rats had more autonomy than the people trying to stop them. They moved from bakery to bathhouse, ignored the curfews, dodged fines, and survived fire after fire. Even the Great Fire of London, decades after Elizabeth's reign, didn't destroy the rats. If anything, it gave them fresh ruins to explore. And so we return to that strange thought from section 1. Who had more freedom? The man who needed a pass to travel from town to town, or the rat who crossed counties by night and vanished by dawn? So, as you drift a little deeper into your pillow, picture this. A rat scurries over a crumbling Tudor rooftop. Below, a bailiff shouts at a washerwoman for hanging linen on the wrong fence. In the distance, a bell tolls for vespers. The rat pauses, sniffs the air, and then climbs through a cracked shutter into a room lined with barley sacks. No one sees it. No one stops it. And by morning, it will be gone, living. Only teeth marks and small footprints in flour. The law may reign above, but below the floorboards, the rats still write their own rules. By now, you've crouched in the shadows beside them. You've watched them skitter across rafters, slip into cellars, and steal a crust from the hand of a dozing apprentice. You've seen how they slip through Tudor law, past holy water and half-hearted traps, under the boots of monarchs and rat catchers alike. And in this final section, we follow them through collapse, not theirs, but the kingdoms. For while empires rise and fall, the rat simply continues. When queens died and rats remained. In 1603, Elizabeth I died. Her reign, long and glittering, had defined an age. With her went the last of the Tudors and the final gasp of a dynasty. But while courtiers wept and playwrights sharpened their metaphors, the rats were already moving on. From palace to pantry, from old to new. The transition from Tudor to Stuart may have shaken the political world, but for the rats, well, it changed very little. Parliament still had wooden beams. Markets still overflowed with waste. The same damp sellers welcomed them warmly. One world ended, another began. And beneath both, the rats kept chewing. Rats in the time of James I. With the ascension of James I, England saw a shift. More laws, more pamphlets, more attempts to tidy the messinnesses of urban life. One act banned the keeping of pigs in London homes. Another imposed stricter fines for dumping offal in the streets. Still, the rats came. James I believed deeply in demonology. He wrote a whole book on witches and spirits, but even he seemed baffled by rats. Unlike devils, they could not be exorcised. Unlike criminals, they could not be punished. Some tried to appeal to natural philosophy, an early version of science. Writers speculated about rats being spontaneously generated from rotting straw. Others believed rats bred from mud touched by sunlight. This idea was known as abiogenesis. Entire treatises were written explaining how rats formed from dirty shirts and damp wheat. It wasn't true, but it felt true, because no matter how many you killed, more came. And so, rather than chasing truth, most Tudor-era thinkers settled on a kind of exhausted respect. Rats were simply inevitable. Rats as witnesses to change. There's a strange truth hiding in the floorboards of history if you want to understand a time period. Follow the creatures that weren't invited, but came anyway. Rats are perfect time travelers. They slip between eras unnoticed. And as the 17th century dawned, rats watched it all. The rise of gunpowder plots and secret tunnels, the shift from Renaissance thinking to early science, the spread of plague and pamphlet alike, the expansion of London into a lumbering, stinking metropolis, and through it all, they kept the same rhythm: know and nest, breed, scatter, return. They were the city's unofficial historians, recording nothing, yet present for everything. The rat as metaphor. Once more, by the time the 1665 Great Plague hit London, most still didn't connect the dots. The rats were everywhere, dead and alive. Their fleas spread the disease. But city leaders blamed bad air and immorality, not fur and fleas. Some religious leaders even claimed the plague had arrived because of the rat-like behavior of Londoners. That is, the dishonesty, the filth, the sneaking and stealing. Rats became metaphors once again for sin, for social decay, for the creeping corruption beneath gilded surfaces. But here's the irony. While people pointed fingers, burned incense, and prayed for salvation, the rats were simply adapting. They were never symbols. They were never evil. They were just surviving, which is more than many people managed to do. A rat's legacy in brick and grain as brick began to replace timber, and tiled roofs replaced thatch, and fireplaces were rebuilt with stone instead of wood. Urban rats had to shift, to but shift. They did. By the end of the 17th century, rats had found new strategies. Burrowing under stone foundations, climbing through early sewage pipes, riding on ships and wagons to new colonies. They didn't fight change. They exploited it. While politicians argued, rats mapped new tunnels. While landlords raised rents, rats found unguarded stores. While fire destroyed London's skyline in 1666, rats repopulated the ruins before the ashes cooled. The city changed, but its true tenants remained. The final comparison, man versus ratlets. Come back to the original question, the strange one that kept nibbling at the corners of this tale. Who had more freedom, the Elizabethan rat or the Elizabethan peasant? The peasant was bound to land, to lords, to curfews, to guilds, to fines, sermons and inspections. He could be taxed for his chimney, arrested for loafing, beaten for gathering wood. The rat. No taxes, no borders, no master, no law. And yet there was no honor either, no name on a grave, no poems, no legacy, save the trails they left in dust. The rat lived, the peasant endured. Neither was free in the modern sense, but in that narrow alleyway of Tudor life, with its walls closing in and plague looming overhead, you could forgive a man for envying the creature that slipped through his walls while he himself needed a written permit to leave the parish. And so we rest as we close this story, and the candles gutter low. Picture the final scene. A crumbling Elizabethan alehouse. The hearth is cold. A ledger lies unfinished on the bar. Outside, the city wheezes in its sleep, but in the rafters, soft footsteps. Not a ghost, not a thief. Just one of history's most successful survivors. The rat doesn't dream of empires. It dreams of warmth, crumbs, and passageways. It asks for nothing and takes only what it needs, and that, perhaps, is why it lasts. Welcome back, dream-bound travelers. Tonight we leave behind Tudor beams and rat-nibbled rafters to take a quiet ride through something equally ordinary, yet absurdly difficult: delivering the mail in 18th century Britain. But before we open the postal bag and trudge through another rainy village, let's do the usual. Adjust your pillow. Dim the lantern on your nightstand. Let the ambient hush of history settle in, because we're going back to a time when the mail was late for reasons that involved ox carts, runaway chickens, unpaid tolls, and yes, territorial geese. That this is not a story of empires. It's a story of muddy boots, parchment bundles, and the strange hazards of getting a letter from point A to point B before the ink smeared. Let's begin. The state of the roads, a national embarrassment in the early 1700s. The average British road was less a road and more a suggestion. Turnpike was a hopeful word. What it often meant was this: a narrow dirt track, uneven and rutted potholes deep enough to break wagon wheels, no lighting, no drainage, and certainly no sun. Major roads between cities like London, Bath, or York were often impassable in winter. Carriages tipped, horses sank, pedestrians cursed and then walked 10 miles back the way they came. Now imagine carrying the Royal Mail through that. You're expected to deliver letters between towns, sometimes across entire counties on a tight schedule and without delay. Wear a red coat and a leather satchel. You might have a small horn to blow as you approach. You do not have boots that keep your feet dry, and it's raining. It's always raining. The early mail system. A patchwork at best, the 18th century British postal system was on paper brilliant in practice. It depended entirely on independent contractors, pub owners doubling as mail agents, paid riders with bad knees and worse horses before the development of the official mail coach system in the 1780s. Most mail was carried by postboys or mail runners, many of whom were just local men with a decent pair of legs and a vague sense of geography. There were no fixed uniforms, no route maps. You might be handed a leather pouch and told to follow the hedge line till it curves near the church, then go on till you hear roosters. This was not an exact science. And delays were frequent. So were accidents. The enemies of mail, let's count. The enemies of the early mailman, thieves, highwaymen, were real. Mail carriers were warned never to carry more than small coin, and some were robbed so often they began hiding notes inside hollow walking sticks or stitched into their vests. Inns and ale. Many carriers stayed at inns overnight, a few too many. Ales, and your post might go missing or get repurposed as kindling dogs, especially in rural hamlets. Aggressive farm dogs were a known hazard. Carriers often carried sticks to fend them off, but dogs weren't the worst, no. The most feared and strangely frequent threat was the domestic goose. The goose problem. Why geese? Because geese are territorial and loud and utterly by red-coated strangers trying to deliver bills to their farmhouse, in dozens of letters and complaints lodged with the early postal authorities. Geese appear as a recurring nuisance. They hissed, they bit, they blocked footpaths like feathery guards at the gate. One report from 1736 includes a note from a post rider near Shrewsbury who claimed, quite sincerely, that a goose had chased him off the path and down a slope, causing him to tumble 3 times over and soil all the correspondences of that day. Another report from a Cumbrian village records the use of a stick, not to beat, but to parley with the goose that had taken ownership of the lane. These geese were often kept untethered, allowed to roam freely, and believed by many to be better watchdogs than dogs themselves. And unfortunately, the mailman had no legal recourse. If a goose bit you, you just limped away. Paper, ink, and rain. Let's pause and think about the letters themselves. Before mass printing, before envelopes with glue strips and prepaid stamps, letters were written on thick folded parchment sealed with wax, often tied with string or ribbon, and addressed with minimal information. For example, to Master Charles, near the mill. 3 fields past the oak, ink smudged, paper tore, rats liked the glue, and if the letter fell in mud, well, hope you weren't waiting on a wedding invitation. Many mail carriers carried packets in oilcloth wraps to try to keep them dry, but leaks happened, so did slips, so did rainstorms that lasted 2 weeks straight. People wrote long, apologetic, follow-up letters saying things like, "Forgive the stain upon the corner, for it was trod upon by a cow in the lane. This letter was delayed 3 days on account of my person being mistaken for a chimney sweep and so detained." You couldn't track your package. You hoped it would get there. Social standing of the carrier despite their importance. Mail carriers were not particularly admired. They were often mistaken for beggars, thieves, wandering strangers, or, worst of all, tax agents. Villagers sometimes refused to open the door unless a known face carried the letter. Some assumed anyone handing them parchment was there to deliver bad news, a debt notice, a draft order, or worse, news from London. But in some towns, the postman was celebrated. Children waited for the sound of his horn. Old women offered him scraps of pie. Young men hoped he brought news of work or love. He was, in a way, the internet of his day. Unreliable, mysterious, and occasionally bitten by geese. A quiet heroism. Let's imagine just briefly that you are one of them. A post runner wearing boots that squelch, carrying a sack of letters across a frostbitten field at dawn. You're not a soldier, you're not a noble, but you carry words between lovers, orders between merchants, news between siblings, the voice of the country passed from house to house, across miles of puddle and bramble. No one thanks you, but without you, silence. So, as you close your eyes tonight, picture this: a muddy track, bordered by stone walls and sleeping sheep. A lone figure walks, lantern swinging, eyes squinting at an unreadable road ahead. Behind a low gate, something stirs. Feathers hissing. Another goose stands guard, ready to defend its patch of gravel. The postman sighs. He tightens his cloak. He takes a deep breath, and once again, He negotiates. Because somewhere ahead someone waits for a letter, and geese or no geese, that's what you're here to deliver. But welcome back, you're still walking, aren't you? The road beneath your boots is soft and uneven. The letter satchel digs into your shoulder. Somewhere ahead, the flicker of a cottage lantern glows through the mist. It might be shelter, or just another farmer who will yell at you for stepping on his hedge. The year is still sometime in the 1700s. Mail is still mostly chaos. And tonight, we step into the middle years, those awkward decades where Britain began trying to modernize communication but hadn't quite figured out how. This is a tale of half-paved roads, unreliable timetables, and postal horns that people both respected and loathed. So pull your blanket a little closer. The storm hasn't passed yet. The tollgate trouble. Picture this. You're a mail rider. Your horse is tired. Your boots are soaked. You see the outline of a toll gate up ahead. Relief. Not quite. In 18th century Britain, toll roads or turnpikes were popping up like mushrooms after rain. Local trusts were authorized to maintain and repair certain roads in exchange for charging travelers to use them. Sounds fair, but there were problems: too many tolls, too many inconsistencies, and some tollkeepers who demanded creative bribes. The mail was supposed to travel toll-free. Legally, it had the king's privilege, but that didn't stop certain keepers from forgetting the rule and demanding a fee. Some carriers would argue, others would pay out of pocket just to avoid delay. A few would simply find detours, even if it meant a mile through someone's cabbage rows. And heaven help you if you were on a tight route with official eyes watching the clock. Timing was everything, and everything was late. One of the biggest misunderstandings about the 1700s is this idea that people didn't care about time. Not true in the postal world. Time was everything. There were handbooks, schedules, and fiercely written memos. But time, back then, was flexible. Not every village had a clock tower. Some ran their schedules by the church bell, the sun's shadow, or the local landlord's opinion. So when the postal office in Bath said the mail must depart at noon precisely, the carrier had to guess whose noon they meant. Add in flooded creeks, sleepy pub owners, or roosters that crowed at the wrong time, and you're quickly 3 hours behind. But the job still had to be done, and letters were growing more important by the year. When the mail coach arrived, sort of in 1784, a turning point came. A man named John Palmer, who had experience managing stagecoach lines, proposed something bold. Why not carry the mail by coach, just like passengers? A horse-drawn carriage, guarded, fast, scheduled, and efficient. Letters would arrive on time, roads would be better policed, and people might actually trust the mail system. It was implemented slowly. At first, people resisted. Some believed it was too expensive. Others thought it dangerous. A few felt it would ruin local which made money lodging overnight mail carriers. But the results spoke for themselves. Where mail once took days, it now took hours. In places like Bristol, York, and London, the mail coach became a symbol of progress. High-wheeled, red-painted, and often carrying both post and passengers. Mailbags were stored in locked compartments. Drivers wore official livery. And most importantly, the coachman blew a horn upon approach, clearing the road. The sound was unmistakable. Shrill, sharp, hopeful, unless, of course, you were standing on the wrong side of a toll gate. The post horn and its curious rules. Let's talk about that horn. The post horn wasn't just ceremonial, it had rules. If you were a mail coach driver, you were expected to blow the horn upon leaving the post town before entering a toll gate when passing through a village. And if you spotted someone on the road who might delay you, each toot had meaning. A single note meant make way. A double meant clear the gate. 3 rapid toots, that was either a warning or a signal to the nearby alehouse to have the driver's supper ready. People began associating the sound with news. When the horn was heard, villagers would line the roads, sometimes in excitement, sometimes just to gawk, and children mimicked the sound with reeds and spoons, pretending to carry news from London. But not everyone loved it. Some tollkeepers, innkeepers, and local vicars found it disruptive. They wrote letters complaining of nightly trumpetings that disturbed the righteous. One even claimed the post horn was used by smugglers to signal each other across hills. Untrue, probably, but it does show how disruptive change can feel, even when it's just the mail. Letters that changed lives or caused fights. Let's pause and look inside the mailbag. Among the damp corners and wax-sealed folds, you'd find love letters with spelling so bad it made poets weep, business contracts written and cramped, Latin orders from distant estates, and, perhaps most heartbreakingly, letters that arrived to late the mail system, while improving, was still fragile. A delayed letter might mean a wedding, postponed a duel, not averted a death, announced days too late for the funeral, and yet people kept writing. Why? Because even with delays and lost parcels and the occasional goose attack, letters connected people. They brought voices across miles, and for many that was worth the risk. The mail as performance. By the 1790s, the image of the mail coach had become iconic. Artists painted it, poets mentioned it, children dreamed of riding shotgun with the driver, horn in hand, and certain post towns leaned into the performance. In Bath, the mail coach's arrival was treated like theater. A crowd gathered at the square. The horses were changed in record time, and the bags were handed off like sacred relics. In London, officials clocked departures with military precision. Every second mattered. But back in the villages where the roads still puddled and the geese still hissed, the mail was still often delivered by a single man with a sack and a stick. Progress didn't arrive everywhere at once, but it arrived. Quiet revolution. Here's something to consider. The British Empire wasn't held together by muskets, or governors, or even coin. It was held together by paper, letters, orders, lists, receipts. The mail was the bloodstream of an age built on words. Without it, no law held, no business thrived, no lovers reunited. And so men walked miles, blew horns, argued at toll gates, dodged puddles, and negotiated with Gasol to deliver an envelope. It wasn't glamorous, it was slow, messy, often thankless, but it worked. Eventually. And now, as you tuck your chin deeper into the blanket, imagine this. A high-wheeled coach rattles down a frost-bitten lane. Lanterns flicker. The horn sounds. A dog barks. Somewhere, a boy looks up and sees the red blur of progress passing by his cottage. He doesn't know what's inside the mailbag, but he knows it matters, and so do you. By now, you've walked beside them through storm-soaked pastures, beside grumbling tollkeepers, past startled villagers and cautious geese. You've watched them hand over letters in candlelit kitchens, warm their hands in stables, and disappear down hedgerow paths before sunrise. But even the age of the muddy mailbag had to end. In this final section, we trace the winding road from rustic to regulated, from lone postmen dodging chickens to an official system that promised and sometimes even delivered timetables. Safety and speed, still candlelit, still worn at the edges. But something was changing. The Postal Act and the power of standardization. It may sound dull, but few things reshaped the mail like the Postage Act of 1765, and later the reforms in the early 1800s. Before this, mail charges were inconsistent. Often the recipient had to pay to accept the letter based on distance and page count. This led to odd habits. People writing in tight spirals to fit more words on one sheet, letters folded and refolded like paper origami to avoid extra charges, and recipients refusing delivery altogether, letting the mailman carry the same letter back and forth for weeks. In 1840, the penny post system began changing everything. A flat fee, prepaid stamps, affordable for nearly everyone. Letters exploded in volume. Suddenly, writing to your cousin in Durham didn't require a financial debate or a scribal miracle, and the people rejoiced. Well, slowly, in stages, as people do. The uniform arrives. With reforms came uniforms. The classic red coat, the stovepipe hat, the leather satchel embossed with a royal seal. The mailman was no longer a mystery wanderer or freelance errand runner. He became an institution. Children began recognizing their local postman by name. Some offered biscuits or bits of apple. Elderly villagers asked them to read letters aloud by the fire. The mailman became a bearer of news, a symbol of reliability, a source of gossip, always tasteful. Of course, they were even expected, informally, to help deliver babies or retrieve lost pigs if needed, and many did. The decline of the mail coach. With all these improvements, the mail coach, once the jewel of the postal system, began to feel slow. By the mid-1800s, the railway was the new monarch of movement. Trains could carry more letters, more parcels, and more passengers faster, safer, and without needing to dodge ducks or fix a broken wheel in the snow. One by one, the great coaches were retired, their horns silenced, their horses sent to farms or parade duty. For some, it was progress. For others, it was the end of romance. There's a story, possibly exaggerated, of an old postman in Somerset who continued walking his original village route long after it had been officially closed. Not because he was paid, but because he couldn't imagine the rhythm of the week without it. That's how deep it ran. Mail in empire, the wider web. Now we stretch our gaze a little farther. By the mid-19th century, British mail extended far beyond moors and hedgerows. It reached India, Canada, Australia, the Caribbean, and outposts as far-flung as Malta and Ceylon. Mail packets, specially built ships, carried sealed canvas bags across oceans, through storms, and into distant harbors. The tone of the letters changed. Colonial orders, military reports, business contracts, and the confused, homesick letters of thousands of ordinary people adjusting to strange climates, languages, and loneliness. Still, geese were a problem. Just different geese. Mail carriers in Jamaica complained of territorial goats instead. In India, it was monkeys. In Australia, it was emus. Truly, the threats shifted, but the principle remained. Someone had to carry the words, postal secrets, undelivered, unclaimed, unsettled, returned briefly to the forgotten corners. Even with the reforms, not all letters made it. Some were illegibly addressed, sent to dead recipients, rejected by families lost in floods or fires, or simply forgotten. These became part of the dead letter office, a place of quietly unopened mysteries. You could find a love letter never received, a payment sent too late, a desperate plea never answered, an apology with no reply, no explosions, no scandals, just paper left unread. And in a way, isn't that more haunting? What the postman knew in every village, The postman knew who was expecting, who was leaving, who never received mail, who read their letters in secret. They weren't gossip, not usually, but they understood people. And perhaps that's the most overlooked role of all, not the carrier, but the quiet observer. The postman saw joy, saw grief, saw arguments in half-open doorways and the flicker of hope in newly inked envelopes. They carried emotion on paper across miles, in storms, for a wage that barely paid for dry boots, but they did it anyway, because someone had to. The goose, one last time, and what of the goose? By the late 1800s, it had faded from the postal complaint logs. Villagers began penning their birds. Towns enforced livestock rules. Modern delivery routes avoided narrow lanes with uncooperative poultry. But still, stories lingered. Old postmen recalled the Shropshire gander that chased 3 riders off their path in 1769, or the Hertfordshire grey who hissed at every coach for a decade, or the Oxford widow, a goose that guarded a fallen postman's hat long after the man had moved away. No one recorded these stories officially, but they were told, quietly, as legends among men who walked more than they talked. The final letters. Let's close with a quiet image. A winter morning, pale light. You're a postman, older now. Knees aching, boots cracked, last route perhaps. You have one letter in your satchel. Just one. You cross the field. The frost crunches. A blackbird startles ahead. At the cottage door. You knock once. A girl answers, perhaps 8 years old. You hand over the letter, nod, and turn. She calls after you. Is it from London? You smile, but say nothing because the job isn't to read, it's to carry. And as you drift into sleep tonight, remember this. Long before wireless signals and blinking screens, there were hands, boots, leather bags, and paper, folded with care. History doesn't just move in speeches and wars. Sometimes it moves quietly, carried one muddy step at a time. Hey friends, welcome back to another gentle, uneventful historical ramble where the facts are dry, the lighting's dim, and the excitement, well, let's just say it politely dozes off halfway through a census before we slip into the warm sands of the Nile. I'd love to know where you're listening from tonight. Drop a note in the comments, city, country, or just the couch, and maybe what time it is for you right now. It's always fun seeing how far this sleepy little channel travels down. Now, if you haven't already, dim the lights, maybe steep a calming tea, or crack a window for some of that nighttime breeze, because tonight, we're not joining the kings or the warriors. Nope, we're shadowing the pencil pushers, the grink, the people who made civilization tick, quietly, but never quite got invited to the party. That's right, we're spending the next few thousand words in the company of ancient Egyptian accountants. Yes, those gloriously dull scribes who counted sacks of barley, measured fish paste, recorded land taxes, and occasionally, if they were feeling bold, corrected a royal surplus ledger. You've heard of pyramids. You've seen tomb paintings. But have you ever considered who tracked the daily bread rations for the temple goat handlers? Well, you're about to. The scribe, foundation of bureaucratic glory. The Egyptians didn't call them accountants. Of course, the more precise term was sesh, which simply meant scribe, but within that broad role lived 1,000 subcategories: tax scribes, temple scribes, military provision scribes, granary scribes, warehouse scribes, and perhaps the most unfortunate, audit scribes. They didn't invent magic, they didn't summon gods, they didn't design pyramids, but they did write things down, and that made them powerful, or at least tolerated. The art of writing, tools of the tediously secular typical scribe's toolkit, was elegant in its simplicity. A wooden palette too, reed brushes, black and red ink, a chunk of linen, water portan. Most often, Alapicus desks were rare. Most scribes wrote while kneeling or sitting cross-legged. They dipped the brush into soot-based ink, tapped it lightly, and wrote right to left, in neat vertical lines. For major records, scribes used papyrus for practice or temporary notes. Shards of pottery or flakes of limestone, called astraca, sufficed. A broken jar could be your tax bill. A limestone chip could hold the wages for an entire construction crew. Every scrap counted, and scribes kept everything. Numbers without numbers. Here's the thing about ancient Egyptian math. It was smart, but weird. They didn't have a place value system like us. Instead, they wrote a line for 1, a horseshoe for 10, a scroll for 100, a lotus flower for 1000, and so on. So the number 3212 would be drawn as 3 lotus flowers to scrolls, 1 horseshoe, 2 lines, no shortcuts. Just repetition, and every time you got it wrong, your superior would suggest you copy out the entire grain inventory again. Neatly with ink, you had to mix yourself taxes, but make them existential. Taxation in ancient Egypt wasn't just about money. It was about order, math, the cosmic balance that kept fields fertile and God's content. Every year, after the Nile flooded, scribes conducted a land survey. This told them how much silt had deposited, how many cubits of usable land each farmer now controlled, and crucially how much grain he owed the state. Too much, you risked revolt. Too little, you displeased Pharaoh. So scribes learned to tread carefully. They measured flood heights, estimated yields, checked against last year's reports, sometimes bribed their way through difficult districts. They weren't loved, but they were needed. and for an ancient bureaucrat, that was as good as gold. The temple treasury, now picture this, a small chamber behind a sandstone temple, cool, quiet, and full of shadows. Inside, shelves of clay jars and labeled baskets, and in one corner, 3 scribes arguing softly over a shipment of salted fish. This was a temple treasury, a combination food bank, accounting office, and divine storeroom. Temples were enormous economic machines. They collected grain, beer, sometimess, exotic animal parts. Scribes recorded everything, who donated one way, how much where it was stored, and which god it technically belonged to. Every item had a destiny, some for priestly feasts, some for offerings, some redistributed to the poor. Especially during festivals, it sounds generous, but mostly it was math, and someone had to record which pot of honey went where, or risk the wrath of an angry temple overseer who believed in divine ledger balance. Hierarchy of the quill knot. All scribes were created equal. At the top, the royal scribe spoke directly to the pharaoh, managed the entire bureaucracy beneath him. District scribes managed provinces. Then, tax and audit scribes in charge of land rolls and granaries, and at the bottom, student scribes, usually teenagers, tasked with copying the instructions of Kajemni, or the satire of the trades, over and over until their ink ran dry. These texts emphasized just how terrible other jobs were, encouraging young scribes to count themselves lucky. One line reads, "The washerman's hands stink like a crocodile's belly. The soldier dies thirsty, but the scribe sits in the shade and eats dates." Of course, they left out the part about back pain and papyrus splinters. When mistakes were problematic, a scribe's life might seem calm, but one error, a single line of math off by a few units, could trigger missed harvest, record an overtaxed village, a temple fedor, even punishment by lashing or exile. So scribes developed tricks, writing draft copies on ostracosking junior scribes to double-check sums, offering gifts or bread to hire scribes for review services. There were no erasers, no undo buttons, only wet linen, and prayer. The afterlife. But with accounting, and here's the oddly delightful thing, Egyptian scribes expected to keep working after death. Tombs of senior scribes often included carved palestini, reed pens, miniature scrolls, figurines posed as fellow scribes or assistants. They didn't imagine paradise as endless leisure. They imagined it as another office, but quieter and slightly less dusty. Because in the afterlife, even the gods needed record keepers, and who else was going to track the sole inventory of the underworld? So now, as your eyelids grow heavier than a granary tax roll, imagine this: a low-lit chamber, cool to the skin, papyrus rustling softly. A man dips his reed brush, straightens his back, and copies the barley ledger once again. He doesn't dream of glory or conquest, just accuracy. Because in ancient Egypt, truth was written down, and the man who held the brush held civilization together. One slow, silent number or return. Now to the scribes of the Nile, to those bent figures beneath reed canopies, inks, fingers curled like hooks, noses dusted in soot and old pollen. In this section, we move beyond the tools and training. We enter the machinery of the Egyptian bureaucracy itself, slumber, sacred and stunningly dull, where a misplaced pot of lentils could trigger weeks of confusion, where festivals demanded new inventories for every goat, and where truth wasn't shouted from pyramids, it was written in triplicate. Welcome to the bureaucracy. Egyptian civilization was many things: spiritual, artistic, agricultural, and deeply obsessed with administrative control. The central government revolved around not just truth or justice, but the divine order of the universe. Maintaining that order required balance in the skies, on the throne, and yes, in the grain stores. Without scribes, Egypt would have crumbled beneath its own rituals. Every harvest, every temple, every military expedition, every shipment down the Nile required paperwork, papyrus rolls bundled with wax seals, stored in mud brick archives that often outlived the buildings they served. Imagine running a country where priests demanded offerings daily, soldiers expected wages, and dried fish farmers owed 2/3 of their barley to state granaries, and funerals had to be documented in 2 registers, one civic, one spiritual. Scribes were the ones standing quietly in the corner, recording it all, not leading, not objecting, just documenting. Temple economics. A religious spreadsheet. Temples were the spiritual and economic hubs of Egypt. In Thebes, Karnak, Memphis, these complexes housed not just priests and statues, but cattle herds, beekeepers, of course, accountants, for example. The Temple of Amun at Karnak owned entire villages and over 80,000 employees at its peak. Yes, 80,000. That meant food, shelter, tools, payments, and schedules, all requiring tracking. One scribe might spend 3 days counting bundles of flax. Another might oversee oil jars in a storeroom. A third might review last year's oxen deaths and compare them with predicted births. These weren't glamorous jobs, but they prevented collapse, and at the center of it all sat scrolls, towering, sun-bleached scrolls, each inscribed with calm, repetitive lines like month of Shemu, day 17, 5 measures, honey, 2 jars of beer, 1 linen wrap, issued 2 boatmen for festival of the horizon, Repeat for 30 years. Bureaucracy meets the body. It wasn't just supplies being tracked. People too were categorized. Laborers, priests, artisans, tenders, boatmen, bread makers, fish altars, each with quotas. Rotations, permissions. The sesh peranquo scribe of the House of Life sometimes kept death records as well as life ones. These included cause of death when known, location assigned, graveyard feet, goods allotted, whether the deceased owed the state anything imagined, being remembered for eternity because a man with a reed pen wrote, fell from ox cart, owed 6 loaves, cleared by cousin. In Egypt, immortality wasn't reserved for the grand, it sometimes came through bureaucratic inertia. The grain economy, flour, fuel, and frustration. Let's talk grain because without it, nothing in Egypt functioned. The economy ran largely on grain-based payments. There were no coins. Instead, workers were paid in grain, priests were fed from grain stores, rent and taxes were calculated by grain. Weight of beer was made from old bread and barley. Scribes at state granaries had an especially thankless job. Each season they had to calculate how much grain had been harvested, subtract what was owed as tax, record what was distributed to the labor force, check for spoilage or theft, ensure the numbers balanced with last season's rolls, and make copies of every report in case a flood destroyed the originals. Granary scribes were known for their paranoia. Some even sealed the doors of storage huts with clay seals bearing their name, just in case anyone tried to steal a handful of barley while they weren't looking. One 19th dynasty scribe left a note in the margin of his report. I counted twice. Do not recount unless instructed. A man after the modern accountant's heart. Paperwork on the move. Port towns and border posts. Egypt's system depended on movement of goods, of people, and of information. Dotted river ports. Scribes inspected cargo manifests. At border stations, they documented livestock moving to Nubia or incense shipments from Punt. On canal locks, they confirmed water rights for different regions. Every shipment of resin, ivory, or wine passed through 3 layers of scribal review: entry list, transit, log delivery, slippy method, transporting a dozen amphorae of imported olive oil and needing to weigh them, smell them to check for rancidity. Count the seals, stamp them with the day's date, get a second scribe to approve the count, then walk 3 days to a temple where a priest half-heartedly nods and hands you a papyrus, recital of which would then be bundled, dried and stored for possibly ever. And yet, things mostly worked. Egypt ran not because of charisma, but because the scribes never stopped counting. The satire of trades, ancient Egypt's career counseling, we mentioned it briefly before, but let's revisit the satire of the trades, a document students copied for centuries. It's a glorified piece of propaganda for the scribal life, and it's hilarious in its overcommitment. The potter's fingers are burnt, the weaver is bent. The tanner stinks worse than fish, but the scribe, he sits in shade, drinking water, writing what others only dare to speak. It paints every other job as a waking nightmare. Fishermen get bitten, boatmen drown, bakers burn themselves, butchers cut themselves, soldiers starve in the desert only. The scribe lives in comfort, assuming, of course, that comfort means copying tax charts until your fingers go numb. Still, it was effective. Thousands of young boys entered scribal schools, dreaming not of fame or conquest, but of not having to smell like fish intestines. A modest dream, but a dream nonetheless. Divine clerks. When the gods needed secretaries, Evan in mythology, scribes were honored. Sort of Thoth, the ibis-headed god, was the divine scribe. He recorded the judgments of souls, the passage of stars, the speech of the gods, and the daily offerings made in each temple and art. Thoth often holds a scroll and reed pen. He's not smiting enemies, he's writing down results. This tells us something profound. The Egyptians didn't separate the sacred from the administrative. Even the gods needed someone to balance the books. As this section closes, let your mind wander to a small room of dust and parchment. The lamp glows low. A pot of ink clinks softly. Outside, the Nile flows past. Inside, a man adjusts his scroll, dips his reed and begins again. 1 sack lentils, 2 linen robes, 1 small goat. Received, marked, recorded. It's not grand, it's not poetic, but in its slow rhythm, it sustained the kingdom. You've walked the storerooms, you've counted the jars, you've sat in the shade of temple columns, listening to the soft rustle of scrolls. Now, as the ink dries on our final scroll, we turn toward what lay beyond, because, for Egyptian scribes, the afterlife wasn't an escape from duty, it was more paperwork. You see, the Egyptian worldview didn't end with death, it simply moved the office to a new department, and in this last chapter of our story, we'll visit the quiet corners of the field of reeds, the Egyptian version of paradise. Even the dead kept records, because even eternity has a filing system, an office in the afterlife to the ancient Egyptian. Death wasn't a halt in existence, it was a shifted journey from the world of the living into the carefully organized realm of the dead. An organization was key. After death, the soul known as the Ka needed many things: food, water, shelter, rituals, and, most importantly, be remembered meant to continue. To be forgotten was to fade, and that's where scribes held their quiet power in life. They documented your deeds. In death, they ensured those deeds were readable. The Book of the Dead, a bureaucrat's greatest hits. You have probably heard of the Book of the Dead, a misnamed collection of spells, hymns, and instructions for the afterlife. What you may not know is that many of these scrolls were commissioned, copied, and personalized by scribes, often for a fee, sometimes by request, and occasionally in advance of death. Some even came with blank spaces to insert names later, like pre-printed funeral programs. Inside was such administrative gems as Spell 125, the famous weighing of the heart, where the deceased declares innocence of dozens of offenses. Spell 17, which explains how to transform into a lotus flower for aesthetic purposes, and Spell 30b, asking your heart not to betray you during judgment. All of this had to be written clearly, spelled correctly, and formatted just so, or else cosmic confusion could ensue. There are examples of incorrectly copied scrolls where the deceased was declared to be a seller of donkeys instead of a beloved of Osiris. A scribe's typo could literally doom your soul, so yes, the stakes were high. Judgment Day. Clerically speaking, let's slow down and step into one of Egypt's most enduring images, the Hall of Two Truths. Here stands Anubis, weighing your heart against the feather of Mat. If it balances, you pass. If not, you're fed to Amit, the crocodile, lion, hippo beast, but off to the side, almost unnoticed as Thoth, the divine scribe recording the whole affair. He doesn't interfere. He doesn't judge. He just writes it down, because judgment without documentation isn't judgment at all. It's gossip. This, for Egyptians, wasn't metaphor, it was procedure. The afterlife was run by clerks' tombs, the scribe's second office. Many elite scribes had tombs adorned not with images of war, but with tools of their trade: carved reed, pens, miniature, scroll racks, false doors to let offerings pass through, and lengthy autobiographies inscribed on stone. One famous tomb inscription from the 19th dynasty reads, "I never altered a figure, I never delayed a count. I reported truthfully to my superior, may Thoth know my name." This wasn't bragging, it was an application, a plea to be accepted into the eternal. Bureaucracy. Because if the afterlife mirrored life as the Egyptians believed, then someone still had to record the sunrise balance offerings, assign stars to their paths, and note who forgot to bring incense on festival day. Better to arrive with references. How memory works in a scribe's world. That the most sacred tool of the Egyptian scribe wasn't the reed pen, it was memory. Not just personal memory, but recorded memory, the kind that outlasts bodies and floods. They believed that what was written down had a chance of lasting forever. That's why names were carved on stone. Kings had cartouche deeds were written in public spaces. To be written was to be made real. To not be recorded was to risk erasure. This is why, after certain pharaohs fell from favor, their names were scratched out of temple walls. To the Egyptians, that wasn't just political revenge, it was spiritual deletion. Errors etched in eternity. But here's a sleepy little twist for you. Even in tombs, those sacred spaces where eternity was carved into find typos. One tomb labels the occupant chief of the royal bread when it likely meant chief of the royal beard. Another lists dates that make no calendrical sense, suggesting either a sleepy scribe or a reused template. And some scribes, likely under pressure to meet deadlines, left incomplete hieroglyphs or skipped entire lines. One archaeologist found a scribe's note at the end of a scroll that read, "I was sick, my hand was weak. May the gods forgive this script." Even in death, the deadline loomed. Who remembers the scribe? As we wind down this section, consider the paradox. These men who recorded history, economy, judgment, and divine ritual rarely had theirs told. They're often anonymous, buried in sand, reduced to scribe of X in dusty museum drawers, and yet their legacy is everything, because without them, we wouldn't know Pharaoh's name, we wouldn't know when the Nile flooded, we wouldn't know how fish paste was rationed during a minor temple feast in 1270 BCI. Their handwriting built our understanding of the past. Their boredom preserved our wonder. They were not kings, not prophets, not warriors. They were the ink behind civilization. One final inventory as you drift toward sleep. Let's inventory one last quiet room together. The walls are mud brick, the air smells of papyrus and beeswax. A scroll is open on a low table, weighted by a small stone. The light is dim, perhaps from a flickering oil lamp. Outside, a donkey brays in the distance. Inside, a man bends over the scroll, muttering softly. He scratches out one number, rewrites it, sighs, adds a final mark, dips his reed, and draws a line under the day's work. He has done nothing grand. But without him, nothing grand could exist, and maybe, just maybe, when he passed into the next world, he brought his tools with him, just in case the gods were hiring. Hey there, traveler. Before we head out on tonight's gentle journey, take a moment to ease into stillness. Dim your lights. Let the hum of a fan settle the air. Maybe stretch your fingers once, just once, and then tuck them close. And if you haven't already, you're welcome to subscribe for more sleepy history. Now imagine the faint scent of dust, spice, and wool. A road stretches before you, and you, quiet listener, are walking alongside a camel caravan bound for nowhere in particular, but everywhere in between. The misnamed road. When people hear Silk Road, they often picture dazzling silk bolts, treasure chests, jade caravans, and merchants trading gold for rubies. But most of the time, the Silk Road was a lot less glamorous, and a lot more practical. It wasn't a single road, it was a tangled network of ancient tracks, trails, and caravan paths stretching from China to the Mediterranean. Through the deserts of Central Asia, the steppes of Mongolia, the mountains of Persia, the dusty towns of Syria, India, and beyond, it was used by emperors, yes, but also by tired salt traders, wool sellers, glass merchants, tin haulish, donkey-riding monks, pilgrims who got lost. Often, in short, it was the Amazon warehouse aisle of the ancient world. If Amazon were a week-long donkey ride between stops and the package might arrive 6 months late, smelling like fermented apricots. Salt, not silk. Let's begin with salt. Salt was a quiet king on the Silk Roads. It preserved meat, flavored barley, and was absolutely essential for survival, especially in the blazing deserts of western China and the dry air of Central Asia. Some routes existed purely to move salt. Rock salt from mines in Persia, brine cakes from oases in western China, sea salt. Blocks carried inland by camel merchants guarded salt carefully. It was dense, valuable, easily ruined by moisture, and it paid better than gold on some routes. Entire towns sprang up around salt depots where porters rubbed raw hands and camels snorted through burlap loads. No banners flew, no feasts were held, but the road ran. For salt, the sound of wool. Another overlooked hero of the Silk Roads was wool, especially coarse wool blankets, shawls, cloaks, and saddle covers. Wool came from steppe sheep near highlands and countless herders along the way. In fact, in some sections of the Silk Roads, wool moved more frequently than silk. Silk was light, rare, and reserved for the elite. Wool was heavy, itchy, and bought by farmers, soldiers, priests, and pilgrims, but it was dependable, durable, warm on desert nights, woven in dusty towns by women who sang while they worked. So caravans hauled bale after bale of rough wool down the same road that once carried silk to Roman senators, and guess which got taxed more heavily? That's right, the wool dot, because everyone needed it. What a caravan really looked like, you might imagine a regal camel line with banners fluttering and trumpets announcing a rich caravan, but real caravans were usually slow, quiet, and splattered and extremely tired. They moved 10 to 15 miles a day depending on terrain. Most had no guards, no guides, no bats, no maps, just a memory passed from one dusty merchant to the next. They carried dried fruits, dyed cloth, rough pottery, olive oil sealed in resin, wooden comb, spools of thread, ink, blocks, garlic, onions, and flatbread. Many merchants walked beside their camels instead of riding them. Riding was for nobles or the sick, and when night fell, they built windbreaks from old saddle blankets, shared hot stones to warm their fingers, and whispered prayers to any god listening, not for wealth, but for safe passage. Boring, profitable items. Want to hear some of the most traded items on the Silk Roads? Here's a short list. Tallow, animal fat, used for candles and soap. Alum, a mineral used in tanning and dyeing. Hemp rope, black dye made from walnut husks. Fish sauce from the Red Sea coasting. Stones, woolen thread, dyed with madder root. Goat intestines used as parchment or sausage casings. These weren't museum pieces, they were survival tools. Merchants weren't chasing wonder, they were chasing inventory. Market towns and sleeping inns along the Silk Roads were hundreds of caravanserais, roadside inns designed for long-distance merchants. They offered a walled courtyard, sleeping platforms, water troughs, basic stalls for mules or camels, and, if lucky, a bathhouse heated by a coal pit. Merchants shared food, mended saddles, traded gossip, and bartered quietly. There was rarely music, never mirrors, and almost always fleas. But these places were vital. They let you rest, warm up here if bandits had been spotted on the Western Pass, and then at dawn you tied up your blankets, nudged your camel's knees, and started again. Strange currency and stranger deals. Money on the Silk Roads came in many forms. Cowrie shells weighed silver, obsidian, bead strings of Roman copper, coins, or even cloth bolts, which doubled as receipts. Some cities had official money changers. Others preferred goods. It wasn't uncommon for a man to trade 3 wool cloaks, 2 bricks of salt. A bronze pot gives 4, gives a barrel of fermented fish paste, and a lump of jade. It sounds chaotic, but the system worked, not because of law, because of trust. And trust on the Silk Roads was more valuable than silk. As we end this section, imagine yourself at a firelit campsite, wind rustling the edge of a wool tarp. Your camel snores gently. Your fingers are dry from salt. You've traded 1 bale of barley for 2 packets of garlic thread. You're not rich, you're not famous, but you're fed, warm, and ready to walk again. Welcome back, gentle traveler. The fire from the caravan. Camp is dim, the stars are thick above. A breeze lifts the edge of your wool blanket. You roll over, but just a little, and listen to the world sigh. Tonight, we continue our journey along the Silk Roads, not in the quiet weight of salt or the coarse comfort of wool, but in the invisible forces that made those goods move. Not all travel is physical, much of it, like now, is political, because nothing on the Silk Roads moved unless the powers that be allowed it, and usually they charged a fee. The toll road of empires in the modern world. We grumble about airport taxes and shipping delays. On the Silk Roads, your biggest concern wasn't customs, it was the local warlord at the next oasis. Every empire along the Silk Roads imposed its own toll system, which could range from a portion of your goods, a fixed silver fee, a promise of return goods, or in some places llamas were traded up from Andean routes into Central Asian circuits in certain medieval periods, though not frequently. More often, the price was paid in salt or service. The Persians, Tang Chinese, and later Mongols were among the best organized. They created rest stations, enforced some degree of safety, and standardized tolls. Others, like the smaller oasis kingdoms, were less predictable. One town might let you pass freely with dyed cloth. The next might confiscate it for sacrilegious color, so merchants carried redundant paperwork, duplicate scrolls stamped with multiple seals from rival authorities. Sometimes they paid tribute to both sides of a civil war just to avoid getting caught in the middle. A lost receipt could mean a lost caravan. And no one wanted to explain to a spice trader from Kashgar why his cinnamon was now imperial property. The Mongol postal system. Speed in a world of slog. Fast forward to the 13th century. The Mongol Empire, despite its brutal reputation, revolutionized the Silk Roads. How? By creating the Yam, a network of relay stations and postal roads that made moving goods and gossip across Asia almost tolerable. The Yam had horse exchanges every 25 miles, food depots, patrol guards, sealed travel passes called Paisi, which were essentially VIP badges. Merchants with a Paisi could bypass most tolls. Their goods were protected under Mongol Lalat, at least on paper, and for a few decades, it actually worked. Historians call it the Pax Mongolica, or Mongol Peace. Under this fragile umbrella, traders moved faster, safer, and farther than any time before. But even this system had rules. Camels had to be inspected goods, inventory taxes levied by class, type, and season, and if your Paisi got stolen, you were now a smuggler, not a merchant. Climate, sandstorms, and other bureaucratic nightmares. Nature didn't care much for empire. Many Silk Road branches passed through the Taklamakan Desert, known poetically as the place you go in but never come out. Its sandstorms could bury entire routes. Merchants left behind shoeless skeletons, abandoned wagon scrolls that were still readable 2,000 years. Later, when rediscovered by archaeologists, some detoured into mountain passes where frostbite was a greater threat than bandits. Others timed their trips by wind season, knowing when the gales would aid or destroy them. But what do climate and sand have to do with politics? Well, empires adjusted taxes based on weather. If a flood ruined part of a spice route, the kingdom upstream might double tolls to recoup losses. If a drought shut down a rival city, your own market might suddenly restrict salt exports to keep the price up. In short, climate affected commerce, which affected law, which changed the lives of every merchant. Paperwork on the move. We think of paper as fragile, ephemeral, but on the Silk Roads, it was one of the most resilient currencies. Chinese paper began replacing parchment and bamboo slips by the 2nd century CE. This made ledgers easier to carry, invoices simpler to copy, and forgery slightly harder depending on ink formulas. Some merchants carried folded passports, written in multiple languages. Princeps, Strigian, and scribes were worth more than gold in some cities, and each document had to be verified, stamped, and folded. Just solest a border guard declare it invalid and send you home. 800 miles poorer. The real value of the road so far. We've talked salt, wool, tolls, and paperwork, but here's a sleepy little truth. The greatest good traded on the Silk Roads wasn't silk or even salt. It was information. Through these winding, forgettable paths past recipes, hairstyles, techniques for glazing, pottery, methods of irrigation, monastic chants, how to make noodles. Yes, the idea of noodles moved from China westward and was reborn in new forms in return. Egypt's linen weaving patterns moved east. Persian perfume techniques reached India, and Buddhist texts reached Japan. The Silk Roads weren't a highway of riches. They were a slow-dripping faucet of shared ideas. No one invented globalization. Merchants did it, quietly, in wool cloaks and cracked sandals, whispering stories as they counted jars. Quiet cities, quiet pause now in a city you've probably never heard of, Merv, located in modern-day Turkmenistan. Merv was once a Silk Road jewel. At its height, it had aqueducts, libraries, one of the largest urban populations on Earth, and yet it faded. Not in war, but in trade. When new routes shifted west, Merv's markets went silent. Its bureaucrats retired early. Its toll guards took up fishing. Its ledgers stopped growing. Today the city lies mostly in ruins, but beneath the sand are broken ink pots, dried papyrus tags, and the occasional glass bead from Byzantium, reminders that boredom is what builds empires, and neglect is what undoes them. So as the wind picks up again and the camels rise with groaning knees, picture yourself in line at a toll checkpoint. Your documents are in order. Your wool is dry, your salt is neatly packed. A man nods, the rope is lifted, and the road continues, as always, into silence. You've traveled far, listener. You've walked beside wool carts. You've waited in line at toll checkpoints. You've shared garlic tea with a tired trader who talked in his sleep. Now you're reaching the end of the Silk Roads, not a dead end, but more like the slow fading of footsteps in shifting sand. Because the Silk Roads didn't collapse overnight. They didn't end with a bang or invasion. They just stopped being used. And tonight, in this final stretch, we'll explore why and what echoes still remain in forgotten markets, disused wells, and recipes whispered by candlelight. When trade becomes a trickling stream by the 15th century, the Silk Roads were shrinking. Not because the goods stopped being needed, but because ships got faster. Sea trade, while initially dangerous and unpredictable, began to move more goods, cover longer distances, avoid endless border tolls, require fewer bribes and camel herders. A journey by sea could take months, but it beat 2 years overland with a wool ration, 5 fake travel permits. Plus, the arrival of Portuguese, Spanish, and later Dutch ships brought new sea lanes that connected China, India, Africa, and Europe directly. The roads stayed, but the merchants changed course. The spice trade, once the pride of Silk Road crossings, now favored ports like Malacca, Calicut, and Zanzibar. Even the most patient camel can't compete with sails and wind. Plagues and blockades. There were other reasons for the Silk Road's slow fade. Take the Black Death in the 14th century. Historians believe it traveled via the Silk Roads, infecting towns as caravans unknowingly spread fleas and plague. Entire markets emptied overnight. Many trade hubs were abandoned, burned out of fear, or closed by local rulers desperate to keep disease at base, and places never recovered later. The rise of the Ottoman Empire and other Islamic powers created new political fault lines. Certain roads were taxed differently or cut off completely, dependent on which empire you aligned with. Travel became more political, and most merchants weren't in it for diplomacy. They just wanted their barrel of pickled garlic to reach its destination. Sodi looked elsewhere. The ghost stations vanned centuries later. Traces of the Silk Roads remain. You can still visit the ruins of caravanserais half buried in desert sands. Step into one, and you might find crumbling troughs where camels drank, a cracked wall with faint scribbles in 3 languages broken, pots once filled with almond oil or fish pastes. Some stations still hold the ghosts of trade. China's done, where monks once copied texts by torchlight, Uzbekistan's Samarkand, where blue-tiled markets whispered prices in Persian and Turkish, Iran's Ray, where perfumes from India met Roman glass beads. They are quiet now, but if you stand still in the early evening, you might imagine a wheel creaking, a merchant coughing politely, the shuffle of wool against worn saddles. Legacy through small things. The Silk Roads may be gone, but their legacy survives in places you'd never expect. In your kitchen, nutmeg from the Banda Islands, cinnamon from Ceylon, saffron from Persia, all once passed through these roads. In your language, words like sugar, satin, jasmine, and bazaar trace their etymology across multiple cultures that met along the roads. In your closet, cotton weaving patterns from India mixed with dyeing methods from Central Asia, and silk embroidery from China. Even the concept of passport documents owes a nod to the multilingual travel passes of caravan traders. So, even if the road is quiet now, its patterns like thread woven into cloth still touch your daily life. Trade without banners. Here's the final truth, and perhaps the most peaceful one. The Silk Roads were never really about glory. They weren't built for kings, though kings used them. They weren't run by empires, though empires taxed them. They were kept alive by potters with cracked fingernails, wool weavers humming songs to themselves, spice traders who didn't sleep well, horsemen who hated paperwork, scribes who never got credit for their maps. In other words, the ordinary. And while textbooks may remember silk and gold, the roads themselves remember sweat. And maybe that's the part that deserves remembering. A sleepy ending at the edge of the road. So now, listener, we pause. You're near the sea. The caravan has gone quiet. Only a single sandal print marks the sand behind your head. Ships bob gently in a harbor you can't yet see. You take off your scarf, wipe your brow. In your satchel, a bundle of wool, a pot of dried salt, a letter from a city that no longer exists. The roads didn't vanish. They just became stories, shared in inns, carved in stone, read aloud under soft candlelight. Just like this. Hey, there, traveler. We've left the dry dust of the Silk Roads behind. Tonight, your feet are wet. Literally, you're standing in the drizzle beneath a medieval bridge, one built centuries ago of creaking timber, moss-covered stone, and iron bolts that groan when carts pass too quickly. You're not a knight, not a merchant, not even a wandering minstrel. No, tonight you are the keeper of the toll booth, the bridge tender, the person with keys, ledgers, and if luck allows, a dry cloak. Before we begin, light a candle, let the soft glow flicker. If there's a rainy window nearby, all the better. Close your eyes, and let's slip into a story that's quiet, slow, and deeply soaked in the forgotten rain of medieval daily life. The bridge that never slept in medieval Europe. Bridges were rare, expensive, and deeply political things. They weren't just for crossing rivers, they were points of control. They meant trade tax and tolls. Most bridges were built by wealthy guilds, or royal decree, some even by local communities, funded through charity campaigns or religious indulgences. But no matter who built them, someone had to live on them. Enter youth the bridge tender. Your job, not glorious, but vital. You kept the gate, collected the toll, inspected the carts, lit the lanterns, shouted warnings in fog, and on lonely nights, you just listened to the cold water, to distant dogs, to the slow decay of wood beneath stone. Your living quarters damp, narrow, and necessary. Your bridge isn't grand. It spans a shallow but wide river in Flanders. The current is steady, not dangerous unless it rains for 5 days straight, which it often does. Your home, a gatehouse at the midpoint of the bridge. It's made of cold stone licky timber, a single iron banded door and one window shutter that never closes quite right inside. A straw mattress lumpy, a 3-legged stool wobbly, a small table with an inkpot half frozen in winter, and a ledger of tolls going back 15 years. You light a fire with damp kindling and boil whatever stew is left in the pot. You eat from a wooden bowl. Your spoon is carved, not very well, from driftwood. This is your life. And you are not bored, because bridges are never still. The toll book in your ledger. You list each cart, donkey, pedestrian, and load. Rates vary depending on the weight of the cart, the number of oxen, whether or not the traveler is clergy, and if they're traveling to market, to pilgrimage, or to war. The rates were written by the local abbey. Some tolls are simple. 1 silver denier for a hay cart, 2 for a wine wagon. Others are odd. 1 boiled egg and a prayer, if the man's walking barefoot on pilgrimage, a handful of salt. If the merchant's cargo is onions, you are both accountant and enforcer, and sometimes negotiator, and sometimes confessor, because when it rains hard enough and the ferries stop running, everyone wants to talk to the person holding the bridge keys. What you see from your window, the world passes like a cold, muddy procession. A few examples. A woman with a mule stacked high with cabbages, 2 monks arguing in Latin about who dropped the coin, per se. Cart of charcoal sputtering under dripping canvas, a noble's messenger galloping too fast and refusing to stop, an old soldier paying in arrowheads because he's out of coin. Some nights, nothing comes for hours. You hear only rain creaking timbers, the distant thunk of logs catching in the river bend. You sip your stew, adjust your belt, and mark the time by candle height. This is the quiet bureaucracy of bridges, a life that's repetitive, but never truly dull, because even silence has different weights. Your duty's boring, yes, but also sacred. Your job is not just about coin, it's about safety. You inspect wheels for damaged splinters, jam the planks, monitor for overloaded wagons. They break beams, clean horse manure off the center path, signal lanterns in fog, record disputes between townspeople, and in times of flood, you are the first line of warning. You measure river height with a rod carved with hash marks. You listen for unusual rushes of water. You run often alone to the church bell if flood is coming, to raise alarm. And if something collapses, you're the one blamed, because bridges are only appreciated when they fail. Visitors of note and not so note sometimes. A bishop passes. He does not speak to you. His guards glare but toss a coin into your bucket. Other times, children bring bread to barter, or farmers beg passage in exchange for 2 onions and a bent nail. Once, a musician stayed the night in your tower, played soft lute songs until the fire went out, and one winter night, a stranger with no shoes asked for shelter. You let him in. He gave no name, but told you riddles by candlelight until you both fell asleep. You never saw him again, but he's still written poorly into the margin of your toll book. Man with riddles. No coin, a job inherited or assigned. No one dreams of being a bridge tender, but someone has to do it. Some inherit the post sons from fathers. Others are assigned by towns in lieu of military service. The work is simple but heavy. You are responsible for every cart that crosses, every tax collector, every barrel not weighed properly. Errors mean fines. Too many fines, and you lose your post. Lose your post, and you may lose your home, because most bridge keepers live in the gatehouse. They maintain that as the rain taps on the roof again and your candle burns low, you wonder how many feet have crossed this bridge, how many didn't stop, and how many, like you, stayed. Some say toll keepers were unimportant, but they never tried building a market without a bridge. You're still here. The fire is just embers now. The stew's long gone. But the bridge, like always, remains. There's a softness in the air tonight, the kind that creeps in before something changes. Maybe it's weather, maybe it's policy, or maybe just a noble with a new idea about toll hikes. Whatever it is, your bridge is not just wood and stone. It's a negotiation between land and water, between towns, between moments of boredom and brief flashes of trouble. Tonight, we look at what happens when the river speaks louder than you do. The river doesn't care. About toll charts, let's talk about floods. But evil rivers weren't tamed. There were no concrete embankments or flood control systems. Bridges were narrow and fragile when the snow melted upstream, or when weeks of rain turned to torrents. The water rose without asking permission. You had a measuring rod, a crude stick, carved with marks. Every morning you checked it. If the water reached Mark 6, business as usual. Mark 8, tell travelers to wait. Mark 10, sound the bell. That bell wasn't for celebration. It was a warning. The bridge may not hold. The crossing is closed. No refunds today. The bell and the bucket. Every bridge had a warning bell, often gifted by the local abbey. You'd pull the rope 3 times, wait, then 3 more. It echoed down the water, across the town roofs, and back again. If the bell failed, you'd run. To the church, to the manor, to anyone who could send help. Buckets were filled. Sandbags, if you were lucky. But mostly it was prayer and hope. Sometimes carts on the bridge were lost. Horses spooked. The central beam gave with a slow, aching snap, and in the morning the world was different. The toll booth soaked, the gate warped, the road underwater. Your job, now, record it. Note everything, even the damage you can't fix. The banquet toll knot. Every crisis was a flood. Sometimes it was feast day. Medieval towns had dozens of feast days, holy days, market fairs, and saint anniversaries. These were cause for processions, pilgrimages, and sudden traffic jams and feast days. The tolls changed. Reduced for clergy, waived for pilgrims, increased for entertainers and jugglers. Because they could afford it, you kept 2 sets of rates, a third, scribbled in the margins. For when the bishop got creative, on St. Evelyn's Day, for example, he once declared that no man carrying blessed bread shall be taxed, which led to a line of traders stuffing their wares into hollowed-out loaves. You confiscated 1 such loaf. It contained 3 sewing needles, a bit of wax, a small bronze icon. You let the man through anyway, because in your job, sometimes the story matters more than the rules. When toll becomes politics, tolls were about money, but also about control. If one lord raised the toll on wine carts, the other side of the river might lower theirs to undercut him. If a monastery got greedy, townspeople would protest by swimming their goods across. Yes, even in winter, you sat in the middle of this tension. Bridge tenders were sometimes asked to spy on travelers, record suspicious names, delay undesirable types by asking for extra proof of trade. You didn't enjoy these tasks, but refusing meant losing your post. So you became fluent in polite deflection. Your wheels seem a bit uneven. Good sir, let me fetch the extra form. We'll just wait for the steward to approve this parchment. You knew how to stretch an hour. Small disasters. There were days worse than flood. Noble caravan refusing to pay, barge crashing into a support, bean may barrel of salted fish falling and cracking open, leaving your tower smelling like rot for 3 months. Once a local boy tried to cross the bridge in stilts. He fell into the river, came back out laughing, but lost a boot and some dignity. You two helped him fish it out. Wrote "toll child" and water into your notes. Not because anyone would care, but because the ledger is your diary, too. The gate is a stage. In times your bridge was a theater. Troops of actors crossed, singing verses as payment. Peddlers shouted rhymes about their wares. Ribbons from Ruang, needles from knots. Salt without ants. Some tried tricks. One man painted his wagon to look like an abbey cart. You weren't fooled. The paint still smelled wet, and the abbot had a visible tattoo. You let him through for creativity. Because sometimes, when the world is soaked and still, a clever lie is more valuable than another jar of pickled eggs. The cold ledger. You keep your records tidy. Each entry concludes the date, weather, fog, drizzle, bright sun, number of travelers, type of goods, amount collected. Your ink freezes in winter, smudges in spring, but the book endures. You press leaves between pages to track seasons. A pressed violet from the year of the big flood. A sprig of mint from the merchant who always sang to his donkey. Your life is ordinary, but the record of it is strangely comforting. Tonight, therivers.com, the toll light swings gently. And you wonder how many feet have passed this way. How many never looked up, and how many remember the quiet person in the tower with the keys. You wake early, as always. Before the merchants, before the monks, before the geese start their honking chorus downriver. The bridge is misty this morning, every stone dark with dew, every wooden beam swollen and silent. A silver-gray calm stretches from bank to bank. You light a candle, warm your hands, and turn, as always, to your ledger. Today, though, there's a rumor that the road builders are coming. When progress arrives by horse cart in your small world, big news travels slowly. A bishop's death, a war in France, a comet. All may take months to reach your ears, but this is different. A new road is being planned. It will divert traffic, cut through flatter land, nearer to the new abbey, away from the riverbed, and more importantly, it won't require a bridge. There's talk of filling in marshes, of stone paving, of grain carts reaching the next town in 2 fewer days. It all sounds efficient. And for you, it sounds like retirement, not the kind with pensions and warm beaches. The kind where you pack your bowl, your stool, and the final, unfinished toll page and walk away, the last travelers for the next week. Traffic thins. Less hay, less fish, less shouting from impatient carters. Your final entries include a widow crossing with a bundle of herbs, a toothless man dragging an empty wagon, a pig that escaped, circled the bridge twice, then ran off into the trees. You begin to record things differently. Not just coin, but smells, sounds, scraps of overheard prayer. You want to remember because you don't know if anyone else will. The ledger as testament, that thick worn book. It holds decades of crossings. It records how trade rose and fell with harvesters, how war changed toll prices overnight, which years brought flood, or famine, or too many onions, but no one will read it. There's no archive waiting for it, no scribe, just a moldy trunk where it will be stored, perhaps, if you're lucky, or burned to warm a clerk's toes. Still, you ink the final pages carefully, one neat line after another. Light rain, south wind, 2 carts, 1 child on foot, no toll demanded. You underline it once, close the book, and exhale. Saying goodbye to stones and silence on your last morning. You walk the bridge slowly. You tap each beam with your foot, as if saying goodbye. You check the nails, feel the grooves in the railing where countless hands gripped in snow, and storm. You sit in the gatehouse one last time, watch the sky turn that familiar, quiet blue, and then you leave. No farewell parade, no monument. Just a small wax seal on a page no one will notice. The bridge lives on. Briefly, the bridge remains for a few more seasons. Travelers still pass, though fewer each week. Eventually, a strong storm cracks the center beam. Repairs are delayed, funds are tight. A decision is made. The bridge will not be rebuilt. People shake their heads but nod quietly. Progress, they say. And with no keeper, the gatehouse is raided by weather and time. The roof caves in. Mice find the ledger. Years pass. The river continues its song, whether watched or not. But something stays. A century later, a monk finds a broken stool beside the ruins of a bridge. He takes it back to his cell, uses it for decades. While copying texts, he never knows who carved it. In a museum somewhere, long after a fragment of the toll ledger is unearthed. No one knows what it is, but a historian, half asleep, smiles at the careful scripted notes, possibly a form of traffic report. They get the translation wrong, but the ink still holds. And that pressed violet, still faintly purple. The legacy of quiet watches. You see, the great kings get statues, the generals get books, the poets, fame. But someone had to keep the roads clear, light, the lanterns out. The onions noticed the swollen river and ring the bell. You were not a hero, but you were a keeper of thresholds, of safe crossings, of honest ledgers, and maybe that's enough, because without bridge keepers, no one gets across. Hey, sleepy traveler, you've walked far, across fields of barley, along cracked sun-baked roads lined with olive trees, and now you've arrived, not at a battlefield, not at an arena, but at a temple. Not one of the grand marble beasts built for Apollo or Zeus, full of marble columns and loud prayers. No, this temple is smaller, dustier, built for Demeter, goddess of grain, of earth, of quiet cycles. And tonight your role is not priest or pilgrim. You are a Neo-Carosa temple servant, not divine, not powerful, but essential. Before we begin, loosen your blanket, dim the lights. Let the imagined scent of ancient herbs and worn clay seep in. Let's step into the soft footsteps of a temple life no one remembers, but that history quietly depends on. You live in the corners. Your job begins before sunrise. The floors are stone cold under your bare feet. The temple is silent, except for birds nesting in the eaves and the coals still warm from last night's offering. You carry a broom made of dried fig twigs. You sweep the dust into a corner. Not because anyone's watching, but because it's your duty. You're one of several Neo-Caro temple caretakers, assistants, and quiet guardians. You wear a simple wool tunic tied with rope, nothing divine about it. You eat boiled lentils. You sleep near the outer wall, but still you serve the gods. The duties no one sees. Being a temple servant in ancient Greece is not glamorous. You clean, oil lamps, scrape wax strips from altar stones, wash the drinking vessels left after rituals, burn herbs to keep away flies and spirits. Often the same thing. You refill water from the cistern, polish bronze offering bowls, replace the worn laurel branches that frame Demeter's statue. The statue never speaks, but sometimes you swear you feel her watching, and you always bow just in case. Sacred dust. The temple is made of limestone, mud brick, and patience. Its scent, a blend of beeswax, ash, and dried thyme. You learn to walk silently, to listen for cracks in the plaster, to fold the wool covers on the donation altar without creasing the edges. Visitors leave coins, braided bread, small carved pigs occasionally, a lock of hair or a note scratched onto clay. You collect them at dusk, record them in a tally book. The most common gift. Wheat. Always wheat. Festival preparations. No glory, just tasks. When the Thesmophoria approaches, a women's festival to honor Demeter, you don't participate. You prepare. You hang cloth banners soaked in wine. You sweep the paths leading to the sacred grove. You collect amphorae of water from the spring at the base of the hill. 20 trips in total. Then, during the rites, you wait quietly in the rear room, sometimes listening to the distant chants, sometimes dozing, sometimes wondering if the goddess even notices. But when the festival ends, and the floor is covered in flower stems and spilled honey, you clean. No praise, no thanks, but always that deep feeling that you've kept the rhythm moving. The quiet book of offerings. There's a book not in the library. It's a leather-bound scroll kept behind the altar, in a cedar chest that smells like sap and dust. Only temple workers can write in it. It lists every offering by name, date, and object. You've copied 1 jar of fig syrup, from Melis the dyer, 7 olives and a wish, from a widow unnamed, broken bronze ring, no note. The gods don't ask for thanks, but the book remembers, and when a storm nearly toppled the roof last year, you were the one who ran back in to grab that book because even forgotten prayers deserve shelter. The sense of sleep at night, when the torches are out and the birds quiet, the temple is yours. You lie on a mat in the servants' cloister near the apse. You listen to wind pushing against the cedar shutters, a dog barking somewhere down the valley, the settling of the earth beneath the old stones. Sometimes you dream of nothing, sometimes of Demeter walking in a field, her footprints filling with wheat. Once dreamed she looked you in the eye and nodded. Just once. You haven't told anyone, but you wrote it in the offering book, just in the margin. No one erased it. And then, one morning, you arrive at the altar and someone has left a loaf of black bread, unusual heavy, scored with lines. No note. You sniff it. Smells of barley and maybe ash. You record it anyway, but you wonder, was it a mistake, a message, or something else you don't know yet, but you feel it. A change in the rhythm, and sometimes the smallest offerings carry the deepest weight. The loaf of black bread stays on the altar for 3 days by custom. Any unclaimed offering is removed after the 3rd sunrise. It's not that it's wasted, but after a point it becomes something else. It might draw ants, or suspicion, or questions from a priest who already thinks the servants are a little too curious. But you leave it just one more day, because you feel in your bones that this loaf was meant for something or someone. The woman in the white cloak, you first saw her during the wheat procession. She stood beneath a sycamore tree near the spring, wearing a white wool cloak with gold thread woven faintly into the hem. Not a priestess too quiet, not a widow too young. She carried nothing, said nothing, but every day after that, she returned. She didn't enter the temple. She just stood nearby. Some days she sat on a stone and watched the doves. Other days she watched you. Not with intensity, just the kind of gaze that says, I see the quiet things, too. Servants speak without speaking in temple life. There are hierarchies. Priests chant. Priestesses pour wine. Wealthy donors give. Servants like you clean wax from statues' toes. But in truth, servants know more. You know who leaves the most generous offerings when no one's watching. You know which priest drinks the wine left for Dionysus instead of pouring it. You know how to read inscriptions upside down while scrubbing the base of a stele. You even learn it quietly from a retired scribe, how to trace letters onto wet clay with your finger. He said you had steady hands. You never wrote your name, but you practiced. And when the woman in the white cloak left a bundle of myrrh, tied in a reed mat, you added a line to the offering scroll. For Demeter, from the silent one beneath the tree. Unusual tasks, sometimes the work shifts. 1 week you're asked to help the cook prepare barley mash for an upcoming sacrifice. Another, to climb to the roof with clay patch to fix a crack. And once, during a thunderstorm, you were tasked with guarding the inner sanctum while the priest fled home to check his olive trees. It was the only time you'd ever been alone with the statue of Demeter. You didn't speak aloud, but you thought very loudly. You thought about your childhood. Your sister lost to illness during a bad winter. Your father's calloused hands. The day you arrived here, hungry, quiet, and useful. Demeter didn't move, didn't blink, but you felt seen. And in your quiet service, you left something invisible behind. The book of names. There is a hidden scroll inside the hollow base of the altar. Few know about it. It lists the names of every temple worker for the last 80 years. Not by glory, not by deeds. Just names and years of service. Your name isn't there yet, but you've seen the pattern. Once someone has served 3 full harvest cycles, Demeter's sacred span, the priestess adds the name in fresh ink. You're nearly there. 3 seasons more, and the woman in the white cloak is still returning, still watching. The story of the forgotten marble foot. During cleaning one day, you find it beneath a basket of broken amphorae. A smooth, chipped marble foot, clearly once part of a statue, weather-worn, toes cracked. No one remembers which god it belonged to. No one seems to care. You ask the elder Neokoros. He shrugs. Could be old Apollo, could be a lost Hermes, could be just a practice piece from a sculptor who didn't finish. You clean it gently. Anyway, set it near the basil sprig you keep for luck. Later you place it behind the altar, not to worship, just keep it safe. Even the broken things deserve a space. When the woman speaks one evening just after sunset, you're cleaning the lamps near the outer wall. The woman in the white cloak stands closer than usual and she says, simply, did she ever speak to you? You don't answer at first, then you nod. Just once. She doesn't ask what the goddess said. She just smiles, leaves a silver hairpin wrapped in linen on the ground, and walks away. You add it to the scroll that night, not as a donation but as a conversation. Rituals within rituals. You begin to notice patterns. The priest who scratches his beard before every prayer, the sparrows that gather each morning exactly when the sun hits the western step, the quiet bell sound that rings when you light the 4th lamp, but only the 4th. You don't know if these are divine signs or just the rhythm of repetition, but they anchor you and you realize maybe that's what the gods want. Not thunder, not spectacle, just presence, steadiness, cup refilled. a candle lit, a name remembered. But now, someone new is arriving. A message arrives from another temple. A visiting dignitary will tour the sanctuary. A noble from Corinth, perhaps. They bring questions, and maybe changes, and so you wonder, what will they notice? The shining altar bowls, the stone columns, or the careful hand behind the silent offerings. The Corinthian dignitary arrives just after noon. His tunic is bleached linen, his sandals lacquered with black resin. He carries a fan made from peacock feathers and doesn't seem to sweat, though the day is hot. He does not look at the servants. He walks past you while you're bent over the basin, cleaning old soot from the incense holder. Still, you bow because some things are done not for men, but for the gods. He's shown the main altar the painted fresco, the ancient amphora once, believed to be kissed by Demeter herself. He asks polite questions, eyes flicking like flies across the stonework. You watch from the edge, invisible and necessary. An unexpected question later as the dignitary walks with the priestess along the colonnade. He gestures at the offering shelf. What's that? Tears. They look where he points. The black bread, still there after many days, unspoiled, dense as stone. The priestess frowns. A forgotten offering, she says. Perhaps a mistake. But you quietly know better because you've touched it. And it's not bread at all. It's clay. Shaped, painted and fired with soot to look like barley bread. It weighs slightly too much. Feels too cool in the hand. It's a message from who? You're not sure, but you think you know who left it. A servant's privilege later that evening, when the temple quiets and even the doves roost without stirring. You unwrap the black bread carefully. Inside, etched faintly in the underside, the fields still wait just that. Nothing else. You stare at it for a long time, then place it back where it was. You never tell the priestess. Some things are not meant for titles or robes. Some things are meant for those who sweep before dawn. A name is added 2 weeks later during a quiet afternoon. The priestess enters the servants' cloister. She's holding the scroll, the one kept behind the altar base. She asks you to fetch ink and a reed pen. Then she hands you the scroll and says, "Add your name. It's time." You hesitate only a moment. Then with steady fingers you write Athena 3 years and 1 harvest. No title, no praise. Just a mark, but it stays. The woman in the white cloak returns one last time that evening, just before the crickets begin their dusty chorus. You find the white-cloaked woman sitting in her usual place. She doesn't look at you, but she speaks. "I dreamed of Demeter again." You sit beside her, silent. She wasn't holding wheat this time. She says she was holding a bowl of water. The woman closes her eyes. "I think that means the season is changing." You don't ask which season, but you nod because something inside you agrees. Temple service ends, but the dust remains. Months pass. The dignitary never returns. The priests age. Festivals rise and fall. And one day you wake and decide, it's time to leave. Not for drama. Just because the broom no longer feels like your only task. You pack your few things. A small clay oil lamp, the hairpin wrapped in linen, the marble foot shoe. Leave the scroll in place. You sweep the floor one last time. And you walk down the hill path just after dawn. The temple after you years later. Another servant will find your name. They will whisper it aloud while lighting the 6th lamp. No one will remember your face, but they will copy your line, just once, in their own script at the bottom of a fresh scroll. Athena once served here. May our hands be as steady. And so, the rhythm continues. Not with fame, but with care. In the end, the gods favor, the steady temples crumble. Statues lose their faces, columns fall. Offerings return to the earth, feeding roots and grasses, but some things remain. A faint trail of incense on limestone, name written in 3 scripts on a broken amphora, false loaf of black bread kept in a museum with no label. No context, just mystery, and somewhere, far away, in the fields beyond the sanctuary, grain grows. And the old rhythms sleep just below the soil, waiting. Hey there, wandering mind. If your pillow is cool and the blanket pulled just right, you've arrived at the perfect moment, because tonight's story has no sword fights, no royal scandals, no dragons, and definitely no excitement, just parchment and silence, and the slow scratch of quill on calfskin. Welcome to the scriptorium. It's not glorious. It smells faintly of mildew and dried glue. The light is dim. The work is endless. But without the tired monks and clerks who filled these rooms hour after hour, word after word, we'd have no books, no records, no quiet windows into ancient minds. So take a breath, settle in, and let's walk quietly among the ink-stained ghosts of the medieval writing world. The world before the printing press. It's hard to overstate how rare books were before Gutenberg. A single volume might take a year to copy. Some took 5, others, especially illustrated or illuminated ones, required multiple scribes, illustrators, and binders. In the early Middle Ages, books were painfully expensive, stored under lock and key, often chained to lecterns, concite, sacred, even magical. The people who made them, not artisans, not artists, they were servants of the page, and their world was small. The scriptorium, where silence goes to die. Slowly you wake up early, always before sunrise. If you're a monk, you're required to pray first. eat some cold broth, or yesterday's oat crust, and report to the scriptorium along narrow room with narrow windows, thin benches and stiff-backed stools. There is no fire allowed near the vellum. Your hands are cold, your nose runs, and the quill you trimmed yesterday already starting to fray. But the rule is, one word at a time, no complaints, no talking, no mistakes. Tools of a miserable trade. Each scribe had a small arsenal of survival tools. A quill, usually goose or swan feather, trimmed to a painfully specific angle, an inkwell of iron gall, incorrosive staining, and hard to wash off skin, a pumice stone for smoothing rough parchment, knife for scraping away errors and sometimes cutting bread, a straight edge, and compass for drawing lines to keep your script straight, weights to hold the curling vellum down. Parchment, calfskin or sheepskin, was expensive. Every mistake had to be scraped clean. You could only rewrite over the scraped area a few times before the page tore. Some scribes cried when that happened. Others just quietly muttered the Lord's name and started again. The monastic assembly line, large scriptorial like those at Cluny, Monte Cassino, or Lindisfarne, scribes didn't work alone. Instead, one monk read aloud from a master text. Several scribes copied at once, in unison. No talking was allowed, but coughing was universal. This meant that if the reader mispronounced a word, every copy got the same mistake. This is how typos became canonical. Monastic scholars once wrote bitterly of discovering that God's wrath had been copied in place of God's grace. A single syllable, a theological disaster. It was also why proofreaders called correctors became a highly respected class of scribes. They didn't make the book, they fixed the book, and they were feared. A day in ink. The day's schedule went something like this. Dawn, short prayer, sharpening quills. Morning, copying from master text. Likely some grumbling midday meal, lentils, bread, probably cold. Afternoon, more copying. Evening, lamplight to dim, forced to stop. In good days, you'd finish 2 pages. On bad days, the ink would smear, your hand would cramp, and you'd spend the last hour scraping parchment and apologizing to saints. But you'd do it again the next day, because the work had meaning, quiet meaning. Marginalia, where scribes spoke freely. Scribes weren't supposed to express themselves, but sometimes, in the margins, they let loose. Medieval manuscripts are filled with complaints, or my hand, or the ink is thin today. Sarcasm, this parchment is the worst I've ever seen. Humor, this is the end of the book. Finally, hope, may the reader not be a fool. Some drew tiny faces, others doodled cats chasing mice along the lines of holy text. One anonymous scribe wrote, "Writing bores me." Another, "Thank God it will soon be dark." It wasn't rebellion, it was survival. The monks who lost their sight over years. The work took a toll. Some scribes developed permanent hand tremors, blurred vision, calloused fingers that cracked in winter, curved spines from endless hours hunched over narrow desks. Some went blind, not dramatically, but slowly. One monk wrote that the letters began to swim after 30 years of copying. He dictated his last texts by voice, until his breath gave out to dot, and still, they copied through famine, through plague, through invasions and bad wine and worse shoes. They copied, because without them, the Gospels, Aristotle, herbal manuals and maps of the known world would vanish. They were not celebrated, they were not thanked, but in every old library, every dusty volume, their hands remained. But the worst was still to come, because one winter the ink froze, the parchment cracked, the new rule arrived from the abbot. No more personal marginalia, no more cats. Why, well, that's a story for the next section. It was a particularly cruel winter. The firewood pile was damp, the oil lamp sputtered, and the ink in the inkwells, thick with iron salts and vinegar, froze. By noon, some scribes resorted to keeping their ink pots inside their cloaks during prayers, nestled against their ribs to keep them warm. One poor monk tried setting his beside the bread oven, only to discover that boiled ink becomes sticky and acidic. The parchment curled, the quills splintered, and the books remained unwritten, which is when the new rule came down from the abbot. No more marginalia, no more cats in the scriptorium, and worst of all, no more break prayers before midday. It was devastating. Why? Cats. Let's talk about cats. You might assume monks kept them for companionship, and yes, they sometimes did. But more importantly, cats were mouse insurance. Parchment was made of treated animal skin, which meant it smelled delicious. 2 rats and mice, a single hungry mouse could chew through a sacred psalter or gnaw the corners off a month's worth of labor. So monks kept cats. Some abbeys had official scriptorium cats fed communally and praised in marginalia. A 9th century Irish monk even penned an entire poem in the margin of a gospel copy about his cat. Panga ban, I am Panga ban, my cat, tease a like task we are at. Panga chased mice. The monk chased ideas. Both worked silently. Why ban them? The problem wasn't mice. The problem was ink prints. Cats. Being cats enjoyed sleeping on warm parchment, especially if it had just been set beside a fire. One scribe in Bohemia recorded an entire section of the Book of Hours, ruined by poor prints. Another cat notorious in the abbey's oral history had reportedly knocked over a precious bottle of blue lapis ink, staining 6 folios and destroying 3 days of work, hence the decree. No cats shall enter the writing hall, lest they trespass upon the word. It didn't stop the mice, but it certainly dampened morale. The war on marginalia, the marginalia ban, however, was more spiritual. The abbot claimed that scribes were becoming too worldly in their commentary. He'd found caricatures, sarcastic notes, and one rather detailed sketch of a pig in a bishop's hat. He didn't know who drew it. He suspected everyone so. New rules were posted. No jokes, no sketches, no commentary, no signature initials unless approved. One scribe wrote in very tiny script. Between the lines, even Christ wept. May I not laugh? It was erased, but the indentations remained, and generations later, someone with a strong light and angled glass would find it again. The scribe who protested with silence at the Abbey of St. Wendelin in the early 1300s. There was a scribe named Theodoric. He'd copied the entire book of Psalms 7 times by hand. On his 8th copy, after the cat ban and marginalia rule, he wrote the entire book without a single mistake, a feat almost unheard of. And at the very end, where scribes normally wrote, "Finished," by the hand of Brother Theodoric, servant of God, he wrote nothing, just blank space. It caused quiet outrage. Some thought it heresy. Others suspected failing eyesight. But those who had worked beside Theodoric for years, they understood. Sometimes, silence is the loudest protest. Ink allergies and scribe sickness over time. Many scribes developed sensitivity to iron gall ink. It caused rashes, joint inflammation, and in some cases, a kind of chronic lung irritation from inhaling the ink's acidic vapors. There were no cures, only tricks. Wearing linen gloves which ruined pen control, holding breath while dipping ink, mixing in honey or plant resin to soften the fumes. Some monks tried switching to red ink made from cinnabar or ochre, but this was frowned upon for anything but headings. One wrote, "The red burns less, the black brings clarity. I long for neither." Vellum shortages and the great reuse crisis one year. After poor harvests, calfskin became expensive, so scriptoria across Europe were ordered to reuse old parchment. The process was called palimpsest. The old ink from a page and writing over it. It saved money. It also ruined lives. Scraping required immense pressure. Scribes tore hundreds of sheets. The old ink sometimes bled through, confusing the new text. Worse, sacred texts were overwritten by ledgers, inventories, and rent rolls. One frustrated monk asked, "Will the word of Paul yield to the price of pigs?" No one answered, but the pigs got copied anyway. One moment of mercy. Not all abbots were harsh. At an abbey in the Loire Valley, a new abbot took pity on his scribes. He allowed a fire-limited marginalia in invisible ink, onion juice revealed by candle flame, one cat female, named Pax. He even gifted the scribes wine every feast of St. Jerome, patron of translators. Under his rule, the abbey produced 11 full gospels in 10 years. When he died, the scribes wrote a tribute. "He let us laugh, he let us breathe, he let us write with joy." But joy was temporary, because the winds were shifting. And in the city of Mainz, a German blacksmith named Gutenberg was working on a machine with movable type. Something that would make scribes unnecessary, but the monks didn't know that yet. What they knew was that tomorrow would come, the ink would be cold, and the parchment would curl like always, and they would keep copying because someone must. But how did they react when the first printed book arrived? That ... is where we'll pick up next. The year was 1452. The scriptorium smelled the same warm ink, dust, old wool robes. The candles sputtered, the parchment curled, but something had shifted. Not in the room itself, in the world beyond word. Had arrived quiet, whispered, nearly ridiculous at first, that in the city of Mainz, someone had invented a way to make books without hands. No monks, no parchment, no tired crooked backs, just metal letters, ink oppressed on end pages. Hundreds of them, identical, fast. It was a miracle, or a heresy, depending on who you asked. The day that book arrived at the Abbey of St. Havel in Bohemia, the scribes gathered around a wooden crate sent from a merchant in Nuremberg. It was wrapped in wool and sealed with wax. Inside, a printed Bible. The abbot held it as though it were a child or a bomb. The pages were clean, black ink, uniform type. Every S looked the same. No smudges, no blood-pricked corrections, no thumbprints from a tired monk. It was unsettling. One scribe whispered, "Where are the margins?" Another asked, "What's the point, if there's no error to forgive?" The reactions, grief, relief, and bitter reactions varied. Some monks wept, truly wept, not for the loss of labor, but for the loss of intimacy. Each letter they wrote was an act of devotion, a slow stitching of soul into page. This was cold. Others felt relief. Finally their fingers could rest. Finally their eyes could heal. And still others reacted with suspicion. If a book could be made without prayer, without silence, without the breath of a holy man behind it, was it still sacred? Could truth be mass-produced? One monk muttered, sipping weak tea. The devil never needed to rest his hand. The last scribe at St. Havel. There was one man, Brother Janek, who refused to stop copying. Even after the abbot approved purchases of printed texts, even after the scriptorium fell quiet, even after the last vellum shipment stopped coming, he Continued, hunched over, salvaged scraps of parchment, mixing his own ink with wine sediment and crushed walnut. He wasn't fast, he wasn't accurate, but he was present. In one of his final pages copied from the Gospel of Luke he wrote, in the margin, "This is my breath, do not press it away." The press arrives at the abbey eventually. The abbey purchased its own printing press. It wasn't stored where the herbarium used to be next to the beeswax storeroom. They hired a journeyman from Germany. He wore fine shoes. He didn't pray before work. He set type like a man playing chess. Quickly, methodically, without affection. The monks watched from the cloister, fingers twitching, unsure whether to bless or curse what they saw. And when the first sheet rolled out perfect, crisp, without error, there was a moment of awe, and then a slow nod. Progress had come, quietly, not with fire, but with ink. What was lost, it's easy now to look back and see only gain. Books for the masses, knowledge spreading faster than plagues, poetry and law, and theology unchained, but something was lost. 2. The personal bond between writer and word, the soft prayer before each sentence, the joy of finishing a single page after a week of effort. The scribes, in their dim stone rooms, knew this, and as they faded from history, they left small messages behind. Remember the hand. Ink is memory. This was made slowly. The old manuscripts sleep on today, in museums and forgotten monasteries. Their work still lives. Parchment cracked like old skinning that turned brown with ogmogins filled with tiny faces. Prayers, cats, complaints, most people never read them. But some do, don't, and in the silence between the lines, they hear something, a cough, a yawn, the scratch of quill on skin, and maybe, just maybe, the breath of a tired monk, writing one last sentence in the glow of candlelight. A thought for you. So, tonight, if you write anything by hand, a list, a name, a single word, think of the scribes, think of frozen ink, of silence enforced by sacred duty, of words made slowly, each one a gift. You don't have to be a monk to write with reverence, you just need to notice the moment. Because like the scribes knew, even the smallest word is a kind of prayer. Hey there, sleepy traveler. If your limbs are heavy and the blanket's warm, you've come at just the right time, because tonight, we're not marching with legions or watching emperors unravel. We're doing something far more exhausting, cooking ancient Roman style. So set aside your expectations. There are no tomatoes, no pasta, no basil, but there is fermented fish sauce, a curious number of dormice, and spices that cost more than a slave. Welcome to the kitchens of Rome, where chefs were servants, fire was unpredictable, and every dish was one breath away from smoke or rebellion. Tonight's recipe, something that smells absolutely horrible and was once served to a senator. Let's begin. The Roman kitchen, a place of smoke, fear, and spilled honey. The Roman Kalina kitchen was not a grand hall with marble counters and silver ladles. It was often a dark, windowless room tucked in the back of a domus wealthy house, or a cramped corner in an insular apartment building. Firewood burned constantly. There were no chimneys. Smoke clung to the ceilings in your lungs. Cooks rarely spoke. They didn't have time. Boiling lentils, spitting roast birds, crushing peppercorns with volcanic stone mortar, and always watching the garum pata ceramic vessel filled with ancient Roman fish sauce. That it was the heart of Roman cooking, and it reeked. What exactly was garum? Yes, garum, the ancient condiment that modern noses reject instantly. To make garum, Roman cooks took the entrails of fish guts, blood, liver, skin, bones, layered them with salt in deep clay pots, left them to rot in the sun for several weeks, stirred occasionally, hopefully with a long stick. After fermentation, the liquid that rose to the top was skimmed off and bottled. That golden, translucent syrup, garum. Romans poured it on everything, meat, vegetables, fruit, even desserts. It added saltiness, depth, and a certain aroma of decay. To us it might smell like a fisherman's sock drawer left on a volcano, but to a Roman noble, it smelled like wealth, a peak. Rome's culinary sadist. Much of what we know about Roman cooking comes from a book called De Culinaria, on the subject of cooking, attributed to a wealthy epicure named Apicius. He didn't cook, he designed, he tested, and he demanded. His recipes included flamingo tongues, boiled sows, womb gelid fish eyes, fruit soaked in vinegar, and pepper roast peacock with feathers reattached before serving. But Apicius had servants to cook these things, and when they failed, he was known to beat them with a ladle or banish them to garum-making duty. There is a note in one preserved scroll he sent to cooks to the stables for ruining a sauce of boiled lettuce. Harsh, but lettuce, apparently, was sacred. The slave cook's life. Most cooks in Rome were enslaved, bought specifically for their kitchen skills, trained in North Africa, Greece, or the eastern provinces, fluent in the spice markets of Alexandria and the heat patterns of clay ovens. A good cook could elevate a household, a bad one could embarrass a senator. But the job was brutal. Cooks were burned by oil, cut by dull knives, cursed by masters, expected to prepare 6-course meals without tasting anything first. Stealing bites was punishable. Some cooked blindfolded to learn by smell and heat alone. They worked in silence, until something caught fire. Then, all shouting broke loose. Dinner for 30. On a clay stove the size of a backpack. Imagine this. You're told a merchant is coming to dinner with 30 guests. The master wants 12 dishes, including boiled eel, spiced lentils, roast goat with dates, fresh oysters and vinegar grilled, dormice stuffed with nuts and honey. You have a stove the size of a child's toy chest. You have no timers, no thermometers, no stainless steel dodge. You have a few shallow pans, clay bowls that crack in the heat. One helper who keeps fainting from the smoke hand. It's already noon. Welcome to Roman hospitality. The dormouse, delimolets, paws on the dormice. They were considered a delicacy. Small, fuzzy, nocturnal rodents raised in special ceramic jars called glaria. You'd feed them nuts and honey until they were plump. Then you'd slit them open, stuff them with pine nuts and herbs, sew them closed with string, roast over a spit. Drizzle with garum and honey glaze. One cook recorded this in a margin. The eyes pop if the fire is too strong. The senator does not like this. Dormice were expensive. So was honey. So was not crying into the pot when you dropped one. Fire, the ever-present threat. Roman kitchens rarely went a month without some fire-related incident. Oil spilled, garum boiled over, or worse, someone left the flatbread too close to the coals and blackened it once. In Pompeii, a cook's spilled oil reportedly caused a blaze that destroyed 3 rooms. He was chained outside and made to sleep beside the broken amphory. Another story tells of a woman cook who was beaten for oversalting the lentils. She later salted everything on purpose out of quiet revenge. The master thought it was an omen for Mercury. He had the house priest bless the pantry. It worked. The cook was reassigned to laundry duty. Smells of the ancient feast by nightfall. The Roman villa smelled like boiled vinegar-burned fish paste, musty. Strodo's water poured on guests' hands. Sweat, but guests were delighted. They reclined on couches, ate lying down, and threw bones on the floor. They toasted to Jupiter and poured wine into silver cups while the cook crouched behind a curtain, praying the goat had cooked through. If it hadn't, he might end up cleaning chamber pots for the next month. But there was one dish, one very bad dish that nearly cost a cook his life. It involved too much cumin, the wrong kind of honey, and a senator who wasn't used to chewing. That's where we'll go next. They called it the night of the stuffed goose. Though no one dared call it that aloud. It was whispered centuries later in market stalls and smoky kitchens. Even scribes in distant monasteries joked about it between copying recipes from a picus. It was the night a cook nearly poisoned a Roman senator, not with hemlock, not with a cursed wine, but with a poorly balanced honeycombing glaze on a stuffed goose. And it all began with a missing jar of silphum, the spice that saved dignity and disappeared forever. Silphium was the crown jewel of Roman flavoring. It grew only in Cyrenaica, modern-day Libya, and was considered so precious that it appeared on coins that it tasted indescribable. Something between garlic, fennel, and sunlight on copper. Roman cooks relied on silphium to smooth over harsh flavors in gamey meats like goose or lamb kidneys. But by the 1st century CE, silphium was nearly extinct. One cook's journal simply read, "The silphium is gone. May the gods preserve our sources." The goose incident. The senator was from Hispania, proud, heavyset, and prone to theatrics. He requested a goose stuffed with figs and pine nuts, basted in honey and cumin, and roasted over a low fire for 2 hours. The head cook assigned the task to a younger slave, Meekin, who was just 17. Had skill. He'd once carved a radish into the shape of a dolphin, but he was nervous. He asked if they had firm. They did not. So he substituted extra cumin, far too much, and the honey had fermented slightly in the summer heat. The result, something sticky, overpowering, and faintly sour with a texture best described as trouble. The dinner unfolds. The senator arrived just before sunset. He reclined on a velvet couch. A musician played a lyre. Slaves poured wine into golden goblets. Dates were served with pepper. Then the goose arrived, glistening, steaming, carved tableside. The senator took one bite, then paused, then coughed, not violently, not dramatically, just a single, dry cough, the kind that makes every cook in the house hold their breath. "Did you," the senator said slowly, "mean to make it taste like a copper coin?" Silence. A dog barked in the distance. Somewhere a door closed softly. The senator stood, left the room, and did not return. The aftermath, panic, punishment, and disappearance followed was pure quiet chaos. The cook who approved the recipe was demoted to garden duty. The apprentice some say he fled to Ostia. Others claim he became a baker in Gaul. One whispered account says he was assigned to garum duty for 7 years. Another version, more dramatic, claims he was forgiven and became the personal chef of an aging actress who loved oversalted lentils. The truth, unknown, but the goose recipe was never served again. Food that could kill Roman cuisine was decadent, yes, but also dangerous. Mushrooms were a constant gamble. The famed Emperor Claudius died, allegedly, from a poisoned mushroom served by his own wife. Lead was present in cookware and sweeteners. Romans often boiled grape musks in lead pots, unknowingly creating a syrup with trace amounts of lead acetate, a sweet but toxic substance. Fermented sauces could go rancid overnight. Figs stuffed with wrong herbs could trigger nausea. Seafood, especially oysters, were lethal in summer if not consumed immediately. And all of it was prepared in dark kitchens with no refrigeration, no timers, and no food safety inspectors, only cooks who knew better, or guessed better. The recipe scrolls and their strange notes. Several Roman cookbooks survive in fragmentary form, and they tell us more than just ingredients. They tell us how cooks pleaded with readers. Boil the lentils fully, lest you offend your guests' digestion. Use cinnamon if available. If not, pretend. Avoid cheese on hot days, unless your guests are brave. In one scroll, someone had scrawled, "If you do not know the herb's name, do not use it." A fair rule, but ignored far too often. Humor in the margins despite the pressure. Many cooks found ways to laugh. Some carved jokes into the wooden prep boards. The goat wins again. If Jupiter wanted fish sauce, he'd make it smell better. And in one scratched tablet found near Pompeii, a line simply read, "I burn the bread so the guests remember me." Whether out of protest, exhaustion, or strategy, we'll never know. But it's clear cooks, even under slavery or service, found small ways to leave their mark, even if it smelled like burnt lentils. A servant's redemption dish. There's one final tale, preserved in oral tradition. A cook once disgraced for overpickling olives redeemed himself by crafting the most perfect honeyed pear dish ever tasted in Rome. He stewed ripe pears in wine and honey, crushed pepper and cumin sparingly, topped it with roasted poppy seeds, served it cold on bronze plates. The senator who tasted it said nothing. He simply finished the dish and clapped once. A small thing, but for a cook, it was everything. And so, even in the face of sour ghee, spoiled honey, or missing foiled, the Roman kitchen endured, because even if Rome burned, dinner would still be served on time, with sauce, and hopefully not fatal. But how did these cooks pass their secrets on? Who preserved the recipes when their masters died? That's where we go next. By the time Rome's empire began to falter, the kitchens were still busy, even as soldiers marched home from distant provinces, even as the Senate frayed into factions, and even as emperors disappeared into legend. The cooks kept cooking. They fed bishops, generals, traders, fugitives, but something was changing, not in the food, but in the memory of it. Recipes once passed down by whispered instruction now needed to be written, because those who had once cooked them, often slaves or servants, were disappearing, their knowledge never formally recorded. So some people, scribes, curious nobles, even bored monks, began to write. And so, Roman cuisine did not vanish. It fermented quietly, in ink. The manuscripts that shouldn't have survived. One of the most famous Roman cookbooks is De Recoquinaria, attributed to Epicus, a name that may refer to a man or perhaps a culinary tradition. Its recipes are strange. Too modernized. Boil sows, udder, and serve with honeyed fish sauce. Stew young crane with pepper, lovage, and wine. Fill the belly of a rabbit with its own brain and crushed peppercorns. There are no instructions on time or temperature, just ingredients. No measurements either, because Roman cooks knew by feel. In one version of the text, a monk added a side note: "No man should eat this alone." Cryptic advice, perhaps, or a warning. The kitchens of Pompeii, a snapshot preserved in ash when Mount Vesuvius erupted in 79 CE. It buried kitchens in place jars, pans, bowls, ovens, frozen mid-meal. In Pompeii's house of the chaste lovers, archaeologists found a hearth with charred lentils still in the pot, crushed coriander, and a marble mortar bones of a goose, partly butchered on. Most moving of all, a loaf of carbonized bread, still scored for slicing. Its baker never returned to it, but its shape, round, marked like clockwork, tells us that baking, like love, leaves behind patterns that survive even flame. Secret codes. Why the recipes were obscure on purpose, some believe. Roman recipes were intentionally vague, not just because every kitchen was different, but because many cooks were enslaved, and knowledge was power. If a master wanted a specific dish, he had to keep the cook. If the cook wrote down exact measurements or steps, he became replaceable, so they used approximation, metaphor sometimes, even false ingredients to throw off less trusted eyes. A scroll might say use pepper when it really meant cumin, or wild fig vinegar, which was code for spoiled wine. It was food as survival strategy. Women in the Roman kitchen, though male slaves dominated the professional kitchens, Roman women, especially matriarchs, also played a powerful role in shaping cuisine. Elite women sometimes dictated recipes to servants, others wrote them in journals, next to prayers or herbal remedies. One scroll fragment reads, "Boil barley until it listens. Then it will take the honey." Poetic, vague, but lovely. And perhaps only a woman who knew both patience and sweetness would understand what it meant. Post-Roman cooking, carrying the ashes forward as Rome fell and morphed into Byzantium. Many Roman recipes lived unaltered, localized, softened by time. Garum evolved into colatura in Italy, and non pla in Southeast Asia. Spiced wine became mulled wine. Stuffed dormice became thankfully extinct, but the approach to food, layered, fragrant, experimental, endured in Arab cooking, medieval banquets, and early Renaissance kitchens. In Constantinople, cooks still boiled sauces with vinegar and dates. In North Africa, they stuffed meats with nuts and herbs as their Roman ancestors had. Even today, a few of these recipes survive. A chicken stew with lovage and leeks, a honeyed date paste stuffed in bread, a fish sauce once fermented in the sun, now bottled neatly for modern palates. The Roman cook's ghost never quite left the table, cooking as memory one modern food historian, while recreating Apicius's Parthian chicken roasted bird with pepper, honey, and garum wrote. It tastes like contradiction, sweet, salty, sharp, soft, like a memory you can't place. And that is what Roman food was, a negotiation between status and scarcity, a gamble between flavor and fare, compromise between who you were and what you had left, and in the end, it fed people. It always fed people. Final recipe scribbled in the dark. One final Roman recipe, found in the back of a crumbling codex, reads: if the day is cold and the guest is tired, warm barley broth, add garlic, honey, a sprig of rue, and never forget the salt. Simple, nothing to impress a senator, but everything a cook needed to comfort a friend. So tonight, as you drift off, imagine the last cook in a Roman kitchen, the coals dimmed, the garum sealed for morning, the goose cleaned and set for salting. He or she leans against a warm brick wall, hands burned, eyes stinging from smoke, and as they close their eyes for a moment, they whisper to themselves, tomorrow we stew lentils, and I will get the honey right this time. A small vow in a small kitchen. But to the people who ate that food, it meant the world. Hey sleepy wanderer, you've made it back again. Maybe the lights are dim now. Maybe your sheets are just beginning to feel like soft togas. Wherever you are, welcome back. Tonight's story is warm, slow, and a bit damp, because we're heading into a Roman public bathhouse, the kind with thick steam, marble benches, and at least one guy humming off-key in a corner. We're not just scrubbing, we're networking, gossiping, eating, arguing, and sometimes getting very, very sweaty. And oddly enough, despite all this soaking, no one's using soap. Entering the Roman baths. Thermi were the social heart of many cities across the empire, from grand metropolises like Rome and Carthage to small provincial towns in Gaul or Britannia. If there was a bathhouse, there was life, and not just elite life. Bathhouses were for everyone, well, every free man, that is. Women had their own hours or separate spaces, and enslaved people could enter only to assist. You'd pay a small fee, strip off your tunic, and be guided through a series of rooms: appetiterium, the changing room; tepidarium, warm air to acclimaticaldarium, the hot steam room; frigidarium, the cold plunge palestra. An exercise yard, because sweating before bathing was key. It was less about cleanliness and more about ritual. In fact, no water actually flowed over you, not in the way we might expect a bath. Sweat first, scrape later. The average Roman did not use soap. Instead, after sweating in the caldarium, your skin would be scraped clean with a tool called astrigil. It was usually made of bronze, shaped like a flattened S, cool to the touch. More often your attendant would coat your body in olive oil, then use the strigil to scrape off sweat, dirt, and oil together. The result, waxy grayish gunk known as smegma. Yes, that's the real Latin term, collected in small bowls. It was disgusting, but efficient. Sometimes the leftover mixture was sold SSO'd as a treatment for joint pain or skin rashes. Romans had strong stomachs, or very persistent marketing. Social, soot and sulk inside the bathhouse. Everyone was equal in theory. Senators bathed next to bakers, poets and gladiators shared towels. Children played games in the palestra while old men debated grain prices under murals of Neptune, but status still slipped through. Slaves waited with towels and perfumes. Massages cost extra, and some men wore rings and jewelry into the baths just to remind everyone they were someone. Also, some bathers brought cheese. Yes, snacks were common. Dried figs, dates, even small wheels of cheese, a light lunch and a heavy atmosphere. And sometimes, people fainted from the steam, or got into arguments over stolen sandals. The sounds of bathing. Imagine the sensory world. Low conversations, echoing in domed chambers, the scrape of bronze on skin, a splash as someone misjudged the cold plunge, wind rustling the hanging towels in the open-air atrium, someone arguing softly about a lost ring, a woman's laughter through the wall, in her own time space, and always the steady drip, drip, drip of condensation sliding down marble. If you fell asleep here, you wouldn't be the first. Heating a giant stone bathtub. Bathhouses weren't heated magically. They relied on a system called the hypercaust, an underground furnace with air channels, built beneath the floors and inside the walls. Slaves stoked the fires, usually using pine or olive wood. It was dangerous, suffocating work. The heat traveled upward, warming the tiles above. Some bathhouses burned thousands of pounds of wood per day. The caldarium could reach 104 degrees Fahrenheit, 40 degrees Celsius, and the floor, if you weren't careful, might burn your feet. One cook's apprentice was reassigned to stoking duty for breaking a wine jug. He lasted 4 days before collapsing. Even in relaxation, Rome required endurance. The missing soap and the myth of cleanliness. Here's the odd part. Despite all the water, the scraping, the olive oil, ancient Romans weren't truly clean by modern standards. Bacteria clung to towels. The water in large baths wasn't changed daily. and parasites thrived in the warm, damp conditions. But for Romans, cleanliness wasn't the goal. Balance was. Bathing was a way to regulate body temperature, relieve muscle strain, prepare for dinner or a public speech show. You weren't some lazy rustic who ignored hygiene, and perhaps, most of all, it was to see and be seen. A routine worth waiting. Formerly, Romans bathed every day, especially in cities and smaller towns. Baths were a weekly treat. Children splashed, musicians played, merchants cut deals. Retired soldiers stretched out on the stone benches and compared scars. That it was where the empire pulsed quietly, humidly, through open pores and half-muttered jokes. And yet bathing was also political. Who funded the baths? Who got to enter first? What happened when an emperor closed a bathhouse? In our next section, we'll look at what happened when bathing became a weapon of prestige, how one ruler nearly bankrupted his province building a bath so large no one could finish it. Baths to the Romans weren't just buildings, they were statements. They whispered or shouted, "We are wealthy, we are civilized, we have hot water on demand." And if you were an emperor, a governor, or even a newly wealthy grain merchant, you built baths not just to clean people, but to impress them, sometimes to control them. And once in the arid hills of Western Asia Minor, a provincial ruler decided he would leave a legacy of steam and stone so large, the city never recovered. The baths of Sardis, a lesson in overbuilding. Sardis was once a grand city, the capital of Lydia, the kingdom of King Croesus, who supposedly invented coinage. By the 2nd century CE, under Roman rule, it was a bustling, provincial town with temples, markets, and a slowly aging aqueduct. Then came Lucius Flavius Apollonius. He wasn't emperor, he wasn't even terribly famous, but he had money, connections, ambition. He ordered the construction of the largest bath gymnasium complex Sardis had ever seen. It would feature a full palestra for wrestling and ball games, a two-story marble-framed frigidarium, 7 bathing pools, most floors with dolphins and tritons, heated wallsies. The walls themselves would glow warm. All this in a town where the local spring barely met demand. Dreams built on clay pipes. The engineers were skeptical. They warned of limited water pressure. They noted that importing marble from Ephesus would require weeks by ox cart. They reminded Apollonius that winters in Sardis could be brutally cold, pipes might burst, but Apollonius had already ordered the statues. He wanted a bronze Apollo to greet bathe, whose a carved inscription in Latin and Greek, an arch wide enough to walk through on horseback. Construction began, so did the spending. Meanwhile, the people waited for 10 years. The city watched the baths rise. The price of olive oil rose, much of it diverted for strigil. Scraping stonecutters were pulled from roads and grain mills. Taxes, once seasonal, became monthly, and still, the pools remained empty. By year 12, the baths opened briefly. Water had to be hauled in barrels. Heating the caldarium required burning every tree in a nearby grove. The opening week saw 3 teens, 2 fights over towel theft, and one local poet who slipped on the marble and claimed divine punishment. By year 13, the bath was closed for repairs. It never reopened. The political weight of hot water across the empire. Emperors used baths to distract, reward, and remind. Caracalla built a bath so massive in Rome, it needed over 1,600 people to run it daily. Diocletian's baths included libraries, gardens, and lecture halls because washing your hands was apparently best done after philosophy. Hadrian installed new pipes in provincial towns to improve his popularity. Historians called it hydraulic politics. But all these came at costs. Enslaved labor wood stripped from forests. Massive public spending. Baths were not funded by magic. They were funded by grain taxes, by conscripted builders, and by the constant churn of an empire trying to look more polished than it often was. Bath riots and soapbox complaints sometimes. The public pushed back. In one town in North Africa, citizens rioted when the local bathhouse reduced hot water hours. A clay tablet survives with graffiti that reads, "May the aqueduct leak forever, for they bathe without us." In another, the governor who had embezzled bath funds was forced to parade naked through the cold frigidarium as punishment. A poetic gesture, if not entirely sanitary. And in one late-era city, bathers simply stopped showing up, choosing to wash in the river rather than sit in crumbling pools full of weeds and frogs. Vanity was no match for drought. Roman baths in decline. By the 4th and 5th centuries CE, the great bathhouses began to close, not with drama but with a soft fate. The aqueducts cracked, the hypocaustes grew cold, the money dried up. Some baths became churches, others became cow shelters. Some were simply buried under layers of dust and dirt, waiting to be found centuries later, and found they were by archaeologists with soft brushes and puzzled looks. Why so many What's that smell? Is this smegma what remained? Ritual without water even after the great baths closed. The idea of Roman bathing lived on. In monasteries, monks bathed less often, but still used steam for penance. In Islamic culture, the hammam inherited and improved the Roman model, adding privacy, architecture, and ritual purity. In medieval castles, private baths mimicked the Roman layout, though with more wine and fewer mosaics. Rome's obsession with warm water and scraping never truly left, it simply evolved. So tonight, as you drift in your own warmth, imagine a bath built too grand, too soon, too high on a hill. Marble halls echoing with a splash that never came. Steam rooms where only spiders now gather, and one provincial governor sitting alone in a cold frigidarium wondering, did I need 7 pools? The end of Roman bathing did not come with a shout. No great flood washed away the marble. No decree banned steam. No final towel was folded and placed gently on a brass hook. Instead, the collapse came slowly, like condensation down a cracked pillar, which has stopped being used, and in their stillness, something almost sacred began to fade. The daily rhythm of cleaning, scraping, sweating, soaking, talking, resting. Let's walk together through the quiet aftermath of an empire that once believed hot water could hold civilization together. Abandoned steam by the 5th century CE, Rome was unraveling. Invasions, economic strain, religious shifts, infrastructure decay. Baths, once funded by imperial taxes and staffed by hundreds, became too expensive to maintain. The aqueducts, marvels of engineering, were falling apart. Some were damaged deliberately during sieges. Others simply eroded. No water, no firewood, no workers. Bathhouses became vast, echoing shells. Weeds grew in the caldarium, moss crept along strigil racks. Birds nested in the corners of once mighty domes. One late Roman poet, Sidonius Apollinaris, wrote, I bathe now in silence. The hall echoes only my footsteps, and the marble feels cold with forgetting. Religious heat with the rise of Christianity, public bathing lost its luster. Nudity, once mundane in Roman baths, was now seen as immodest. Mixed-gender bathing, once tolerated or segregated by ours, was frowned upon. New values emerged. Humility, privacy, spiritual purity. The church did not ban bathing outright. The mood shifted. A place once filled with body oil and small talk became a reminder of Roman indulgence and decline. Still, in many monasteries, steam was preserved. Monks kept simple bath routines, modest, separate, regulated. They bathed not for luxury but for penance, health, or ritual preparation. The flame of the hypocaust dimmed, but it never died completely. Echoes in Islamic hammams. Meanwhile, Roman bathing found a second life elsewhere. In the Islamic world, particularly under the Abbasid Caliphate and later the Ottomans, the Roman bathhouse was reborn as the hammam, cleaner, quieter, more intimate, with separate spaces for washing, prayer, and rest. Hammams fused spiritual cleanliness with the Roman idea of staged bathing. Warm room, hot room, cold plunge. The ritual lived on. Marble floors, domed ceilings pierced with small round windows, oil-slick skin, steam curling around ankles, whispers in tiled corners. Bathing, once imperial, became devotional. The final scrape, one curious custom that remained for centuries. Even into the medieval period, was the scraping of the skin. Even without full bathhouses, some people preserved the strigil tradition. In rural Italy, farmers scraped sweat with wooden blades after field work. In Byzantine hospitals, olive oil and scraping were still used to draw out the fever. It was a kind of tactile memory. Rome's silent whisper still clinging to muscle and skin. Forgotten. Pools beneath modern streets today. Many of Rome's ancient baths lie beneath layers of city and time. Some, like the baths of Caracalla and Diocletian, remain as grand ruins visited by quiet tourists and nesting birds. Others lie forgotten under train stations, shops, churches. Occasionally, during renovations, workers uncover strange things. A curved wall of brick, scorched black bronze hinges fused with calcium deposits, a pile of strigils buried in compacted soil, a mosaic of dolphins grinning up through centuries of dust. Archaeologists pause, squint, and imagine the ghost of steam. The bath ritual as philosophy. Many Romans, bathing wasn't hygiene. It was a philosophy. You sweat to open the body. You scraped to remove burden. You soaked to realign the soul. Marcus Aurelius, Stoic emperor and accidental sleep aid to many modern ears, once noted. Consider the bath: oil, sweat, dirt, grey water. All this we endure for ease. Why then do we resist the cleansing of thought? Bathing, for him, was an allegory. To wash was to examine, to scrape was to unburden, to soak was to surrender to time. So why didn't they get clean? That question. Why all this time, all this effort, and still not clean in our modern sense? Because Romans didn't define cleanliness as we do. They didn't use soap, they didn't sterilize, they didn't rinse under fresh water, but they felt clean, balanced, restored. Seen in a world of chaos, empires rising and falling, laws changing, climates shifting, the bathhouse offered a few hours of consistency. Even if the water was shared, even if the floor was hot, even if your sandals were stolen, you emerged scraped, oiled, scented, and reminded that life could still flow, even when the empire cracked. The last bather, imagine. Now one of the last true Roman bathers, a clerk, middle-aged, tired, he enters the bathhouse, knowing it will soon close for good. The frigidarium is already dry. The walls are cold. Only one brazier still burns. He removes his sandals, sits on a stone bench, and oils his arms out of habit. He scrapes slowly. He exhales, and as he sits in the silence, surrounded by echoes of laughter and steam from decades past, He whispers, "Tomorrow, I will wash at the river. But tonight this marble remembers me," and in that moment he is not just bathing, he is remembering, and so are we. Hey there, welcome back. If you're here again tonight, it likely means one of two things. You're a little curious about history, or very, very tired. Either way, you've come to the right place. Let the fan hum gently, tuck yourself in like a sack of barley, and drift with me to a job so uniquely terrible, so undeniably real, that it somehow makes every modern workday seem like a vacation. Because tonight, we meet one of the least celebrated figures of medieval life. No, not the knight, not the monk, not even the cook. Tonight, we're descending quite literally into the world of the gong farmer. So, what exactly was a gong farmer? In the most medieval of euphemisms, a gong referred to human waste, the kind that accumulated in privy pits, castle garderobes, and public cess trenches. A gong farmer was the brave, and usually desperate, soul tasked with removing it by hand, by shovel, by moonlight. This was not a job one aspired to. It was a job one survived, and yet, across towns and cities from London to York, gong farmers kept civilization from collapsing into disease and filth. Quietly thankless lie. So tonight, let's follow one of them just for a single shift. Midnight in the privy court of the gong farmer always worked at night. In some towns, it was a legal requirement. No hauling human waste through the market square during daylight. Imagine, the sun has set, the streets are quiet, a few candles flicker in upper windows, and from the alley behind the tavern, you hear the low clank of a wooden cart, the rustle of leather gloves, and maybe a muffled curse. That's him. He wears layered tunics, already stained beyond hope, thick boots, a damp scarf tied around his face, and in his hands, a shovel, a hooked pole, and a lantern. The scent, well, let's not pretend. The tools of the trade that gong farmers' gear was basic but essential. Long-handled shovel to reach deep into cesspits without falling. In metal hook to clear blockages, in chutes and pipes, thick gloves often waxed or tied. If the gong farmer could afford them, wheelbarrow or cart lined with straw or wood ash to absorb the worst of it, lye and sand for covering the waste and masking smell somewhat. He might also carry chalk to mark a completed pit, or a whist signal to other laborers when a cart was full. In many towns, the waste was dumped outside city walls, used on distant fields as fertilizer. Occasionally, went straight into rivers. Nature was the final employee in the sanitation chain. Privy pit politics not. All toilets were equal. A wealthy merchant might have a garderobe, a tall shaft built into the side of his home with waste collecting in a pit below. A poor tenant might have shared access to a single seat over a trench, often full by week's end. The gong farmer, paid by the load or by the household, developed a mental map of every cesspool in the district. He knew which pits were full, which chutes were clogged, which households underpaid, and which taverns tried to dump animal entrails to mask unpaid debts. He also knew how to stay alive while knee-deep in decomposition. Hazards of the job: this wasn't just unpleasant, it was dangerous collapse. Some cesspits caved in, swallowing workers whole. Fumes, methane and ammonia built up in enclosed spaces. One careless lantern could ignite a deadly fire. Sickness. Gong farmers suffered from skin infections, lung irritation and digestive illness despite their oddly high resistance to common plagues. Rats, lots of them, and bold. In some cases, the gong farmer tied a rope around his waist, with a second laborer waiting above ready to pull him out if he collapsed or slipped. This was not romantic history. This was maintenance, in its rawest form, pay and reputation. Now, you might be wondering, why would anyone do this? Because the pay was decent, sometimes surprisingly good. Gong farmers in London earned wages equal to skilled craftsmen, especially when the Black Death left labor in short supply. But socially, they were avoided, mocked, and often forced to live outside city limits. Some towns banned gong farmers from entering churches during services. Children threw stones, servants gossiped. Still, these men held the line between a functioning city and a cholera outbreak. Without them, the stench of history would have been far worse. And what about the royal stuff? Ah, yes, the privy of kings, even monarchs needed to go. And while gong farmers handled most town waste, the king had a more prestigious version, the groom of the stool. Yes, that was the real title. This man was trusted to attend the king during bathroom visits. He kept records of digestion. He offered cloth. He knew when things were irregular. It was a position of intimacy, and oddly enough, political influence. More on that in our next section. Tonight, as you settle deeper into your pillow, think of this while noblemen debated in firelit halls, while poets composed verses about stars and saints. A single man in stained boots scraped filth from beneath their feet. He worked silently. He smelled terrible, but without him the city would drown. And still he wasn't the worst paid man in town in most medieval jobs. You kept your hands dirty and your head down, but what if your job was to get very close to royalty, to kneel beside them in a private chamber, to pass them cloth, observe their posture, and sometimes even offer medical notes on what came out? Welcome to the quiet dignity and occasional awkwardness of the groom of the stool. Yes, it was a real position. No, it's not a joke. And yes, he really did sometimes taste things, if the court physician ordered it. Let's take a closer look. Origins of an unusual title. The title groom of the stool comes from the stool of ease, or commoda portable, wooden toilet, often padded with velvet, placed in the king's private chamber. The earliest records of this role date back to the Tudor period, but variations of it existed long before. It was a position of intimacy, and oddly enough, trust only. A few men ever served in this role, and their access to the king's body and secrets gave them a power few nobles could match. The duties more than just wiping. You might imagine this job was purely hygienic, and it partly was, but the groom also prepared the royal toilet each day, ensuring it was clean, perfumed, and discreet, monitored the king's diet and digestion, scheduled private time, so no one disturbed the monarch, maintained detailed records of health and stool quality. Yes, logs of logs carried the velvet-covered commode on royal journeys, controlled access to the king during these private moments. In short, he was a gatekeeper to the thrones. Other throne. Trust, proximity, and political influence. Here's where it gets fascinating, because this job wasn't just about wiping, it was about whispering. Imagine being the only person allowed near the king during his most vulnerable moments. You hear things, you earn trust, you become a confidant. Some grooms of the stool became key political players. Hugh Denny, under Henry VII, handled not just linens but treasury records. Sir Anthony Denny, groomed to Henry VIII, became one of the most powerful men in the realm during the king's final years. Others were granted estates, titles, and advisory roles. Being close to the royal backside meant being close to the royal ear, the poop-tasting myth, or reality. Now to address the most whispered rumor. Did someone actually taste royal poop? The short answer, yes, sometimes, but not regularly. In certain royal households, especially in the late medieval period, court physicians occasionally asked attendants to observe or even taste feces to assess digestion or illness. It sounds wild today, but before microscopes or blood panels, texture and color were key diagnostic tools. Most likely, this task fell to doctors, apothecaries, or low-ranking servants. Still, if a groom of the stool was the closest witness to digestion, they might be asked to describe things in, well, uncomfortably vivid detail. A day in the life. Let's imagine a morning with Henry VIII. The king wakes. The groom is already nearby, discreetly checking the commode. A servant brings hot water and cloth. The groom sets the seat, ensures the curtains are drawn, and waits outside until summoned. Afterward, he disposes of waste, notes the king's appetite, and quietly informs the physician if anything seemed concerning. By noon, the groom might be helping the king dress, or updating a ledger. By evening, he might be relaying sensitive gossip or passing notes to diplomats, all while the nobility gossips about his true influence. It was a strange power, both servant and counselor, both silent shadow and trusted advisor. Hygiene in the palace. Despite the glamour, the royal court was not always the cleanest place. Palace latrines often emptied into moats or ditches. Scented herbs masked smells, but only barely. Chamber pots were common, and sometimes simply emptied out windows. In this context, the groom of the stool's attention to privacy, cleanliness, and routine was more essential than it seems. He preserved dignity in a place where even kings had indigestion, social class, and selection. Interestingly, grooms of the stool were often noblemen, especially in later periods. This wasn't a role. For the average chambermaid, it was a career path, with trust and lineage considered important. You didn't just wipe, you advised, reported, and even helped arrange private meetings. By the 17th century, the position had evolved into something more symbolic, closer to chief personal secretary. But its origins, squatting beside monarchs, were never forgotten. Public reaction to the public. The groom of the stool was both mocked and feared. Pamphlets and ballots poked fun at his duties. Caricatures painted him as overly intimate or corrupt. But behind the jokes was a strange respect, because in a world where access meant influence, no one had more private access than the man who folded the linen and asked politely if the king was feeling ... regular ... from chamber to cabinet. Over time, the role shifted further away from actual toilets and toward administrative power. By the time of George III, the office of groom of the stool no longer involved commodes at all. It was effectively a senior position within the royal household, and eventually the role disappeared silently without scandal, just like a well-trained attendant. So tonight, if you're drifting off with a blanket tucked around you, warm and comfortable, imagine this: palace. A candle flickers in the king's chamber. Outside the door, a man waits not for glory or battle but for a polite nod, a whispered update, a moment of strange, soft trust, and history. Some parts of history disappear with a bang. Revolutions, invasions, treaties. Others just quietly slip away, like the echo of water down a stone chute, or the slow crumbling of a wooden privy behind a long-abandoned manor. And so it was with the gong farmer and the groom of the stool. Not exiled, not abolished. Just gradually replaced by plumbing, privacy, and progress. Tonight, we sit in the soft afterglow of two of history's strangest jobs, and ask what their quiet vanishing tells us about the world we live in now. When cities stopped smelling as much by the late 1700s, European cities were beginning to rethink the concept of waste. In London, cesspits were overflowing. In Paris, the stench was legendary. In Rome, ancient aqueducts still existed, but were crumbling. The Industrial Revolution didn't just bring machines, it brought infrastructure. Engineers began designing sewer systems. Brick tunnels, iron grates, and long drainage pipes replaced the manual labor of the gong farmer. Where once a man and shovel removed waste under moonlight, now machines and sluices carried it away by gravity. Was it cleaner? Absolutely. Was it safer? Mostly. Was it free of error? Not even close. In 1858, the Thames River became so clogged with human waste that Parliament had to hang soaked curtains in vinegar to mask the odor. They called it the Great Stink. And suddenly, sanitation was a political issue. The gong farmers' legacies, the pits dried up and the carts stopped rolling. Gong farmers faded from memory. Don't statues, no songs, no heraldry or coat of arms, but their legacy lives on not in marble, but in plumbing. The daily flush is a silent salute to men who once scraped and carried what the rest of society refused to acknowledge. In a way, they were urban immune systems, cleaning quietly behind the scenes, holding off collapse one pit at a time. Today, waste workers, sewage engineers, and public health teams continue the work, less visible, but no less vital. We don't think of them when we turn the tap, but we should. The groom's final bow, the last official groom of the stool, served under King Edward VII, though by then the role was purely ceremonial. As the monarchy modernized, so too did its rituals. Indoor plumbing became common in palaces. Personal attendants became aides de camp or private secretaries. Digestion notes were replaced by doctors' charts, but for over 4 centuries, the groom of the stool held unmatched intimacy with sovereigns, not because of what they did, but because of when they did it. In the hush between policy and pageantry, there was always someone quietly waiting with a cloth and an ear. The odd comfort of humble jobs. In a strange way, there's something deeply human and oddly reassuring about these roles. History often celebrates kings and queens, battles and speeches, but civilization is built just as much by those who cleaned up after banquets, changed chamber pots in royal bedrooms, hauled waste through alleys at midnight, noted digestion patterns with quiet seriousness. There is honor in maintenance, there is dignity in unpleasant necessity, and there is history in the unglamorous. We just rarely write about it. When toilets became privatized, bathrooms moved indoors. They also moved inward, where once defecation was communal, as in Roman public latrines or castle guardrobes. It became individualized. The invention of the modern water closet in the 19th century meant one thing above all: you didn't need anyone else anymore. No gong farmer, no stool group, no CHAMBERMAID. Just you, a handle, and the whoosh of FORGETFULNESS. It was a triumph of privacy, but also a quiet farewell to shared systems. Remembering the unseen. So tonight, as the room grows quieter and your breathing slows, spare a small sleepy thought for the men history forgot. The gong farmer, who walked cobbled streets beneath a waning moon, shovel in hand, nose wrinkled but focused, doing the work no one else dared. The groom of the stool, who stood beside kings, offered linen with a bow, and guarded secrets not found in any diary or state paper. They remind us that history is not always glorious. Often it is smelly, awkward, and absolutely essential. A final whisper. Imagine a cool autumn night in 16th century London. A gong farmer passes your window. His cart creaks, his boots are thick with clay. He nods to you, silently, and behind him, tucked in velvet and shadow, a royal groom scribbles in a tiny leather-bound logbook. His Majesty's stool, firm, modestly scented, appetite intact, blessings upon the cook. No cannon, no crown, just 2 men doing necessary things for people more celebrated and far less grounded. Welcome back. If you've been with us for a few stories now, you've trudged through Roman legions, sniffed your way through medieval cesspits, and perhaps even nodded off beside a chamber pot or two. Tonight, things get ... quieter, still dirty, yes, but differently so. We're going to talk about ink, specifically a kind of ink that once wrote the world. Before pens clicked or printers whirred, there was a woman, many women, actually, who spent their lives turning oak galls, iron salts, and patience into something that would outlast the parchment it touched. This is the story of a medieval inkmaker, one who didn't sign her name, but whose ink preserved kings' decrees, saints' prayers, and shopping lists for centuries. So turn your pillow, let your mind quiet, and meet someone whose fingerprints are everywhere, yet entirely forgotten. The black liquid of memory for hundreds of years, roughly the 5th to 19th centuries. The most common ink in the Western world was something called iron gall ink. It was black, it was permanent, and it was surprisingly acidic. If you've ever seen an old manuscript where the ink is eaten through the parchment, making faint holes in the shape of letters, that's iron gall doing its slow chemical dance. But before it ever landed on parchment, someone had to make it. Not in grand scriptoria, but often in kitchens, cellars, or quiet work tables tucked beside firelit hearths. And in many villages, that job fell to women. Meet Agnes, the inkwithlets call Her Agnes. We don't know her real name. No inkmaker ever signed their work. But we do know what she did. Agnes lived in a dampstone cottage near a monastery in 13th century Flanders. Her husband died young, perhaps of illness. She had 3 children, 2 of whom survived past 5 to feed them. She gathered oak galls. Brown, knobby growths formed when wasps laid eggs inside oak trees. The tree reacted by growing a gall, a kind of defensive wart. These galls, once dried and crushed, became the key ingredient in ink. The process, slow, messy, magical Agnes's work began in autumn. She would walk the forest edges basket in hand, scanning the underbranches for the telltale not-soaked galls. She'd crush them with a stone, soak the powder in rainwater and let it steep for weeks. Then, she added, iron salt softened from rusted nails or scraped pots and stirred until the liquid turned deep, purplish-black to thicken it. She might add gum arabic from acacia trees. If the ink was too thin, it would run, too thick, and it clogged. Quills. Agnes tested every batch by dipping a feather into it and writing 3 Latin letters, A, M, and R. Those letters told her everything: how the ink dried, how it spread, whether it would survive time or fade. The smell of ink. Her cottage always smelled of vinegar and iron with faint hints of mold and smoke. Visitors rarely came inside. The floor was always damp. Her fingers, permanently stained gray-black, looked diseased. Children whispered that she touched the dead. Monks, however, respected her. They needed her. Ink. Every week she filled small glass flasks or ceramic jugs, sealed them with wax, and sent them to the abbey scriptorium in exchange for bread, herbs, or sometimes beeswax candles. Ink as currency. Ink, in Agnes's world, was more valuable than salt. It was what turned thought into permanence, what let a monk remember a sermon, what allowed a merchant to track debts. In many rural towns, no one knew how to make it, and so Agnes, for all her poverty, had something no one else did: the power to make words happen. The risk's iron gall ink was permanent but volatile to much iron, and it corroded the page. Too little, and it faded within months. Agnes once ruined a whole batch. 5 days of labor lost. When a mouse fell into her steeping pot, she cried, not because of the mouse, but because her rent was due and the monks had run out of old parchment to trade. This job didn't just stain fingers, it chiseled away at your patience. The intimacy of ink. Over the years, Agnes began to recognize the monks' handwriting. She never met them, but she saw their personalities in each loop and flourish. Brother Matthias, whose Latin S always curled, like a sleeping swan. Brother Jerome, who pressed his pen too hard, leaving dents in the parchment. The novice who wrote sideways and always blotted page 3. Agnes felt oddly connected to them. She knew they blessed the parchment, but she had touched it first. Legacy in silence. Agnes never signed her name. Her children grew and left. One day she simply stopped making ink, but centuries later, in libraries from Bruges to Oxford, her ink still survives. It darkened, it burned through some pages, but it endured. And when scholars admire the beauty of medieval manuscripts, they often forget that a woman like Agnes stirred the first stroke of that beauty in a clay pot beside a smoky hearth. Tonight, as you drift off, imagine her, a quiet room, the sound of rain on stone, a spoon scraping the bottom of a bowl, fingers dark with iron and oak. And somewhere in the corner, a single candle burning beside a flask of black, glossy liquid. If you've ever stood in a museum and admired the dark script of a medieval document, its letters tight and dense, its black ink still vividive, probably never thought about the person who stirred that ink into being. But tonight, we're thinking only of her. We left Agnes, our fictional but deeply plausible medieval inkmaker, in her cottage. The fire was low. The gold-soaked bowl rested under a muslin cloth. Her fingers were stained again. Now we return to her, not as she works, but as she wonders, because even the humblest laborers, even those without books of their own, could sense the importance of what they were touching. And Agnes, for all her silence, was no fool. A world written in black by the 1300s. Nearly every legal contract, gospel, psalm, poem, letter, and will in Western Europe was written in iron gall ink, from king's edicts to apothecaries' herb lists. It was the default ink of daily life. Because it was permanent, because it was cheap, because it worked even in drafty monasteries and candlelit corners. The Magna Carta, iron gall ink. Leonardo da Vinci's notebooks, also iron gall ink. 1,000 forgotten wills and prayers, all scribbled with a liquid made from tree tubers, vinegar, and iron. The daily trade for Agnes this meant a small but steady rhythm of trade. Every Friday, a lay brother from the nearby abbey came by foot to her door. He never said much, a polite nod, a glance toward the brewing flask. Sometimes he brought cheese or dried pears. Agnes would wrap the flask in wool, tied with a bit of twine, and hand it over like it was a potion. In a way, it was. This ink didn't just record events, it became history. It was the membrane through which memories traveled. The dangers of a bad batch one winter. Agnes's ink spoiled. Too much moisture, not enough iron, maybe a draft, had chilled the steeping mixture. She didn't know, but when the monks used it, the ink faded within a week. 2 sermons had to be recopied. The charter lost its legibility. The abbot was angry, not violently, but with that quiet, terrifying disappointment that only churchmen could perfect. Agnes cried that night, alone beside the hearth, her hands trembling as she sifted more galls. She couldn't afford another mistake, not at her age, not with 2 bad harvests behind her. That batch became known as the Grey Week, and for years the monks referred to it quietly when correcting student work, even in failure. Agnes's ink became part of the monastery's memory, passing it on. Agnes never intended to teach, but one summer, a girl named Beatrix Snow, older than 12, began hovering outside her window. At first, she ran when Agnes turned to look, but eventually she approached, barefoot and curious. Her mother was gone, her father a fisherman, often drunk. She didn't ask to be taught, she simply watched. And Agnes, without really meaning to, began to speak out loud as she worked. "These galls are too light. You want the heavy ones. If it smells sour but not sharp, it's probably good. Always write with it before you seal the flask." Soon, Beatrix was helping, grinding galls, stirring slowly, cleaning cloths. She never learned to read, but she knew how to make ink that lasted. In a few years, she was making her own. Agnes called her little night fingers. Beatrix called Agnes Auntie Stain. They rarely hugged. But one day, when a monk praised the thickness of that week's ink, Agnes let Beatrix keep the coin. That was love. Ink that traveled. 1 flask of ink was once sent to the next abbey miles away for a visiting scribe. That scribe, impressed by its depth and dryness, asked for the supplier's name. The monk who delivered it didn't know. "All I know is she's old, quiet, and smells like rust and lavender." Still, word spread. By the time Agnes reached 60, her ink had touched at least 5 monasteries, 2 bishop seats, and countless parish churches. It even inked a land deed signed by a minor noble whose descendants would eventually appear in English peerage books. Agnes never knew. She died not long after, fingers still smudged, the fire low, a batch half-finished. Beatrix finished it, and with that, Agnes's final ink became the first batch of Beatrix's new life. A note on the science. Modern scientists have studied surviving samples of iron gall ink with UV light and spectroscopy, found 3 consistent traits: a deep purple-black tone that oxidized over centuries, trace elements of oak-derived tannins, often fingerprints burned faintly into the paper signatures of the makers. They don't know whose prints those were, but some came from women. Some came from hands like Agnes's, and all of them wrote history without ever holding a title. Final years in the shadows. Agnes never saw the world. She never traveled more than 10 miles from her home, but her ink did. And in a way, it carried her voice. Every blot, every faded line, every brittle curve of a monk's cheek bears the silent trace of her labor. You won't find her name in any illuminated manuscript, but if you breathe deeply in an old library, in that strange cool paper air, you might catch a trace of her iron vinegar smoke and the faintest hint of oak. You've followed Agnes through forests and seasons, from gall to inkpot, from cottage to monastery. You've watched her fingers blacken, her routines sharpen, her work quietly ripple outward from the damp stone walls of her home. Now, on this final part of her story, we move further out past her death, past even Beatrix to follow the path of her ink itself. Because iron gall ink was never just a product, it was a chemical companion to history. It stayed behind, even after its makers had long faded. Tonight, we follow the ink and the soft, almost imperceptible way it kept speaking. A legacy without a name. In 1842, a British conservator named William Blades examined a crumbling manuscript from the 1300s. He wasn't looking for the scribe's name. Instead, he was cataloguing decay. The ink had eaten through much of the vellum. The letters were crisp, but surrounded by a ghostly halo where the paper had turned brittle. To him, it was just a chemical reaction. To us, it was Agnes's recipe still alive, in a sense, still burning. Burned into the padrine gall, ink has a peculiar quality. It etches itself into the fibers of the page. Unlike modern ink, which sits on top, this medieval blend seeps in bonds and darkens over time. Sometimes it becomes so acidic it destroys the page. Some documents from the 13th and 14th centuries now have lace-like holes where the ink once was. Entire words have vanished, leaving only context and guesswork behind. But here's the quiet beauty of it. The ink that erased the parchment was also what preserved it for so long. Nothing else lasted. Not the hands, not the voices, not the breath, just the black. Just the message, clinging to the void. The scribes never knew the scribes who dipped their quills into inkpots made by women. Like Agnes had no idea what the ink would do centuries later. They didn't know about acid hydrolysis. They didn't understand oxidation. They weren't thinking about longevity. They just knew the ink needed to flow well, dry fast and not smudge. And Agnes knew this too, so she adjusted. She stirred longer in winter. She stored the galls differently. During damp summers, she tested, she watched that, and so unknowingly, she made ink that would outlive every bishop who signed with it. When ink outlives the message, one of the oldest, Surviving pieces of medieval music was written in iron gall ink on lamb vellum today. The melody is gonna erased by time, by mice, by poor storage, but the black notes remain. Little black diamonds floating in the blankness, stubborn and perfect. No one sings the tune anymore, but the ink remembers. In a way, Agnes's ink kept a song alive even. If the sound has disappeared, Beatrix is batch Beatrix. Agnes is quiet. Apprentice continued the work long after her mentor passed. But times were changing. Monasteries shrank. Printed books became more common. The quiet rhythm of quills gave way to the clatter of presses. Ink was still needed, but now it came in glass bottles. Made in bulk, sold by traveling merchants. Beatrix kept making her ink anyway. Maybe out of habit, maybe out of mourning, maybe out of pride. Her final batch was never delivered. It sat sealed in the corner of a cottage until the roof caved in. The bottle cracked. The ink dried to a shiny black crust still staining the floor beams of what became, centuries later, a root cellar, somewhere in Flanders. Those floorboards remain. If you scratch them with a knife, they'll still mark your hands. The color of memory black is often associated with endings. But in the medieval world, iron gall ink was a beginning. It was the start of a record, a vow made real, a law ratified, a confession made permanent. And behind that, hidden in kitchens, in cottages, in aprons and cracked spoons, were people like Agnes. They didn't write the words, they made the words possible. And then they vanished, like smoke from a hearth, a thought for the sleepy mind as you lie in bed now, warm and quiet. Think of all the forgotten hands behind the great texts of history. The parchment maker who scraped the skin, the child who harvested galls, the woman who stirred iron salts into murky, tea-colored water, the novice who spilled ink on his habit, the archivist who misread a date, conservator who sighed at yet another faded page. History is rarely written by the victors, it's preserved by the meticulous, the stained, the underpaid and the unseen. Closing the book, so here's to Agnes, to her stained hands, to the steady rhythm of her spoon, to the quiet smile when a flask passed inspection, to the ink that held shape through time. She will never have a statue, but somewhere, in a brittle ledger or half-burned charter, her ink holds firm, and tonight, in the soft flicker of your screen or the hush of your headphones, she is remembered again, not loudly, but deeply. Welcome back. Tonight, we leave behind parchment and ink and drift back, much further, to a time when scrolls were stacked sky-high, when the written word smelled of wax and sea salt, when the known world's greatest collection of human knowledge was lit by oil lamps and whispered through papyrus. Yes. Tonight we visit the Library of Alexandria, but not the stories of grand philosophers or mathematicians. Not the ones who studied there, or burned it, or mythologized its loss. No, tonight we walk slowly behind the scholars. We sweep because someone had to. Someone had to collect the ash from burnt-out lamps, to clean up the scraps from wax seals, to dust the benches where scholars debated the shape of the stars. We're going to spend a while with the man who swept the Library of Alexandria. He wasn't famous. He didn't write any scrolls. He couldn't read Greek or Latin or Hebrew or Demotic. But every night, he saw what the scrolls saw, and no one remembers his name. The forgotten custodian, let's call him Kemet. It was a common name in Egypt, old earthy, meaning black soil. Like the fertile Nile banks, Kemet lived sometime around the 2nd century BCE, during the later years of the Ptolemaic dynasty. The Library of Alexandria was already legendary. Scholars traveled from Rome, Athens, even India to read, argue, and donate scrolls. At its height, the library may have housed hundreds of thousands of texts. And through its marble halls and reed-scented corridors, Kemet walked every morning and evening with a broom, not a symbolic broom, a literal one bundled reeds bound. With twine. His arrival each morning midst shift began before dawn. The corridors were quiet, the sea air drifting in through tall windows. He'd enter through the servants' arch, nod to the sleepy guard chewing date bread, and hang his woven satchel on a peg. Then the work began. He swept wax droppings from night lamps, collected olive pits, tidied the spaces where scribes had copied and spilled ink, picked up crumbs from barley cakes abandoned by distracted mathematicians. He wasn't allowed to touch the scrolls, but he often brushed around them carefully, conscious of how easily a single breeze could scatter 1,000 years of thought. The smell of knowledge. The library didn't smell like books. It smelled like papyrus, warm olive oil, sea salt, and damp sandalwood from scholars' sandals. Sometimes, faint traces of perfume, myrrh or frankincense clung to visiting royalty. Kemet associated certain scents with certain rooms. The astronomy alcove smelled metallic from the bronze instruments stored there. The philosophy wing of all smelled of ink and silence. No one joked there, but the medicine scrolls. Those smelled like vinegar and dried herbs. Laurel pennyroyal, maybe something sour he couldn't name. Once he sneezed near a physician's scroll and was given a look that could have turned Sphinx to stone. The weight of the scrollschmidt wasn't a reader. He didn't know how to hold a scroll properly, but he understood reverence. He once watched the scribes argue for 40 minutes over a single letter in a Greek word. Another time, a royal tutor scolded a boy, not for misreading but for touching a scroll with dirty fingers. So Kemet took to washing his hands before sweeping the floor near scroll tables. Not because he needed to, but because he respected the scrolls. Even if he couldn't read them, he knew they mattered, even if no one told him why. The whispering dusts late in the day, when the scholars were gone and the torches burned low, Kemet sometimes paused in the central rotunda. The ceilings stretched impossibly high. Every sound echoed like a slow drum. He liked to stand very still and imagine the scrolls whispered to each other. He couldn't hear the words, of course, but he thought maybe they discussed the stars, or argued about shapes, or told each other jokes in languages long dead. He smiled at that thought. A scholar once spoke to him just once, a visiting scholar from Satranyang, sharp-tongued with fingers stained dark from ink, passed Kemet one evening and asked, "Do you ever wonder what's in these scrolls?" Kemet nodded. Slowly. The man paused. "They're mostly arguments, old men debating who's smarter." Then he walked off laughing. Kemet didn't laugh because he'd already figured that part out. The slow decay then. The library was beginning to decay, not in flames, but in corners. A cracked pillar here, a moldy window frame there. A few scrolls turned brittle. Too long exposed to the sea wind, Kemet began to notice more rats. He swept droppings away silently, knowing no scholar would thank him for protecting their scrolls with a reed broom. He never said anything. That wasn't his place. But sometimes he'd linger in the dark corners and whisper warnings to the papyrus. "Hold tight. They don't see you crumbling." A single scroll. One morning, Kemet saw a scroll left behind, a single unmarked roll beside a cracked pot of ink. He didn't touch it, but he stared at it a long time. He imagined it contained the answer to a question no one had yet asked, a name never spoken, a story half told, or maybe it was just a grocery list for the kitchen steward. He never found out, but he never forgot it. His final desk. Kemet worked there for nearly 40 years. When his joints stiffened and his eyesight dimmed, they replaced him with a younger man who swept faster, but didn't pause to listen to the scrolls. No one held a ceremony. He simply stopped. His satchel stayed on the peg for weeks before someone claimed it. And yet, in the quiet moments between pages and footsteps, some say the floors still remember the rhythm of his broom. Some knowledge burns, some fades, but some is simply swept aside. When we last walked with Kemet, the silent sweeper of Alexandria's most sacred repository of knowledge, he was being quietly replaced. No farewell, no acknowledgement, just a broom handed to someone else. But that does not mean his work was lost. Tonight, we follow the trace of a life not written in ink but in dust, and how even the smallest footprints can press against the vaults of time. Because while the world remembers Ptolemies and philosophers, the library would have drowned in clutter and ash had it not been for people like Kemet moving quietly between greatness and grime. The layers beneath the scrolls. Alexandria was a mosaic of ideas, faces and footsteps. The library stood at the center of it all, not just as a building but as a symbol. People imagine it as a single great hall. In truth, it was a network of rooms, annexes, outdoor spaces, courtyards, and even secondary branches throughout the city. Dust settled differently in each one. Near the harbor it was saltier, near the mathematics halls, drier, laced with chalk, and near the philosophy wings, it smelled faintly of parchment and oiling, thicker and darker than the scribes. Preferred. Kemet had come to know the language of these floors. He knew where dust collected and why. He learned to judge the weather by how the ash scattered, to track footsteps by their patterns, and to sense which scholars were close to tears by how hard their sandals slapped the ground. He never spoke of this knowledge, he simply acted. Cleaning the gods in the western gallery stood a long-forgotten statue of Thoth, the ibis-headed god of wisdom, balance, and writing, while few prayed to him anymore. The statue remained tucked in a niche between scroll cabinets and brass instruments. The marble was stained, the beak chipped. But every morning Kemet dusted Thoth's shoulders. He did not ask for wisdom, he did not speak aloud. But when the wind rattled the shutters at dawn and oil lamps flickered low, he sometimes paused to nod at the god. He swept beneath his feet more carefully than anywhere else, because in the library of human knowledge, it seemed only polite to tidy beneath the divine one. The ghosts who whispered the scrolls of Alexandria were not silent. They cracked when unrolled. They murmured when copied. They hissed faintly when scholars argued over translation. And at night, when the corridors emptied and the sea breeze stirred the lantern wicks, their rooms themselves sounded like breathing. Kemet grew accustomed to these sounds. They didn't frighten him. They comforted him, because in those breaths and rustles and shifting shadows, he recognized the presence of something eternal, not gods, not ghosts, not even memory, just the weight of knowledge. Waiting. The scribes who forgot few ever acknowledged Kemet. Fewer still remembered his name. The scribes were always busy disputing authorship, correcting passages, replacing missing vowels in foreign tongues. One day, particularly flustered scholar spilled an entire vial of vinegar on the tiles. Kemet arrived before the floor was stained. He blotted and scrubbed and dried it clean. The scholar walked past without a word, but a few days later, Kemet found a small scrap of parchment folded neatly under the edge of his SATCHEL. No words, just a tiny drawing of a broom. He kept it for years. Lessons from a broken lamp one night. A servant knocked over a bronze lamp while dusting the astronomy table. It shattered, spilling oil across the tiled floor. The guards panicked. The curator shouted. The flame flickered dangerously near a basket of papyrus scrolls. Kemet, knees cracking and hands shaking, ran barefoot across the hall and stamped out the oil with his cloak. He was reprimanded, not for his action, but for stepping too close to the instruments of measurement. He said nothing. But the next morning, the curator left a loaf of honeyed bread near his usual bench that in Alexandria counted as an apology. The day the scrolls web train rarely fell in Alexandria, but one spring, a violent storm blew seawater through a cracked window in the western wing. Several scrolls warped overnight. The edges curled. Ink bled into ink. Years of copying spoiled. Kemet found the mess before the scribes did. He wrapped the scrolls in cloths, brought them near the kitchen's low hearth, and fanned them dry. Some were saved, some were lost, but all were handled with care. That afternoon, he was allowed for the only time in his life to carry a scroll across the courtyard. He walked slowly, reverently, as if holding a sleeping child. The quietest goodbye. Eventually, Kemet's back bent lower. His steps grew slower. His fingertips ached from years of twine and soot. He did not retire. There was no system for that. One day, he simply did not return. A younger man took his broom. The floors were cleaned faster. The rotunda was dusted brighter. The statues polished, but the scrolls never whispered to the new man. He swept too quickly to hear them. A month later, a tiny pot of lamp ash appeared beside Thoth's statue. No one claimed it, but a few scribes nodded knowingly. What the ash remembers them is a theory unproven but romantic that traces of human skin, sweat, and breath can embed in the fibers of parchment. If so, then Kemet lives on in those scrolls, not in words, not in ideas, but in the spaces between them, the margins, the footnotes, the particles of soot beneath the ink. He is the ghost of the blank spaces, the custodian of what held the words together. You may never find his name in a scroll, but if you visit the libraries of the world and you walk the oldest halls, listen closely. If you hear a soft brush against stone, it may just be him. The great library of Alexandria did not end in a single night of fire, as the stories often claim. It faded, like parchment left in the sun, like the scent of ink after a room has been cleaned, like a memory not quite forgotten, but no longer spoken. And Kemet, the man who swept its floors for nearly half a century, was gone long before its final scroll turned to dust. But tonight, in the last part of his quiet story, we follow what happened next. Not to him, but to the spaces he cared for, to the pages, to the floors, to the silence that remained when all the whispering stopped, when the scholars were gone for a while. Alexandria tried to hold on. The scholars stayed. The scrolls stayed. But fewer donations arrived. Fewer ships carried foreign manuscripts. Ptolemaic politics grew volatile. New rulers brought new priorities. Eventually, the museums and academic center connected to the library fell into decline. The philosophers dispersed. The scribes retired. The arguments stopped. And in the early morning light, the long halls echoed not with footsteps or lectures, but wind. The new dust after Kemet's time. A new kind of dust settled. Not wax or ash, but neglect. Cracks formed. In the marble birds nested in the alcoves, the scrolls, still breathing ink and meaning, sat untouched. No brooms passed. No oil was lit. No hands brushed away cobwebs from the feet of Thoth. And so, for a time, the library stood still, waiting the fire. It wasn't just one history. Debates what happened to the Library of Alexandria. Some say Julius Caesar's troops set fire to ships in the harbor, and the flames spread. Others blame Christian zealots who saw pagan knowledge as poison. Still others accuse Caliph Omar's armies, centuries later, who supposedly declared that if the scrolls agreed with the Quran, they were unnecessary, and if they didn't, they were dangerous. But none of these accounts agree. Most are exaggerated. Some are likely apocryphal. What we do know is this: the library did not burn once. It faded over time, like all things do. Books were moved, scrolls sold, knowledge dispersed, walls collapsed, ash covered the tiles. And no one swept it away. A final brushstroke in a later century, perhaps the 6th or 7th, CEA monk walked through the ruined structure. He wrote nothing of the scrolls. They were likely gone, but he mentioned the marble floors. He said they were worn to glass from generations of footsteps. And in one